Hi guys. Tonight we step into a place where cold is not a season but a constant presence, where the ground crunches beneath your boots and the air itself feels sharp enough to cut skin. You stand on rough northern soil, breath fogging instantly, eyelashes already stiffening. The sea is close enough that you can smell salt, yet far enough away that it offers no warmth. Wind slides over low hills without obstruction, testing your balance, your patience, your resolve. This is not a land that welcomes hesitation. It demands shelter immediately. You probably won't survive this without one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, and let yourself remain standing here for a moment longer as the story begins to move. You quickly realize that the cold isn't the dramatic enemy people imagine. It doesn't roar. It doesn't attack all at once. It seeps. It creeps. It settles into your joints and thoughts. Vikings understood this deeply. One widely accepted historical detail is that survival in Scandinavia depended less on individual toughness and more on collective design. Strength came from structure, from shared space, from building something that could quietly resist winter day after day. You look around, and there are no towering forests like the ones in children's books. Trees exist, yes, but they are shaped by wind and scarcity. Timber is valuable, and you treat it with respect. You don't build quickly. You build deliberately. Every cut matters. Every choice echoes forward into months of darkness. The first instinct is not height, but length. You don't want a tall house fighting the wind. You want something low, stretched, hugging the ground like an animal conserving heat. This is where the idea of the longhouse begins to take shape, not as a grand statement, but as a practical answer. Long, narrow, shared, a single roof instead of many, one fire instead of several, fewer walls for warmth to escape through. You feel the ground beneath your feet. It's not frozen solid yet, but it will be. Vikings often chose slightly raised land, not for the view, but to avoid meltwater flooding the floor during early thaws. There's an unromantic wisdom here. Comfort comes later. Dryness comes first. Some archaeologists point out that even a slight slope could mean the difference between livable space and a damp, mold-ridden nightmare. There's a quirky detail that doesn't always make it into textbooks in some regions. Early builders would test a site by lying down on the ground overnight to feel how the cold pooled. If the chill felt heavier at dawn, the spot was abandoned. It sounds almost folkloric, but stories like this linger across oral traditions. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or later embellishments layered onto practical knowledge. As you begin to imagine walls rising, you notice how the wind behaves. It doesn't just blow, it curls, dips, and accelerates around obstacles. Vikings paid attention to this. Longhouses were often aligned, so their narrow ends faced prevailing winds, reducing pressure on the broad walls. This wasn't aesthetic, it was survival engineering, learned slowly, through failure, through winters that punished mistakes. You kneel and run a hand through soil mixed with stones and grass. This earth won't just sit beneath the house, it will become part of it. One mainstream fact, quietly supported by excavation evidence, is that early longhouse walls often combined wooden frames with packed earth, turf, or clay. Wood alone wasn't enough. Earth added mass, and mass slowed heat loss. It's physics, but it feels almost instinctive here. The idea of a house as a separate object doesn't quite exist. Instead, the structure grows out of the land. You can already sense that this building won't stand apart like a modern home. It will merge. Rooflines will blur into hills. Grass will eventually reclaim the top. In winter, snow will pile thickly, adding another insulating layer. The house doesn't fight nature. It cooperates with it. You pause and listen. There is sound even now. Wind sighing through grass. Distant water moving under ice. Your own breath, loud in your ears. Vikings knew that silence could be dangerous. A good shelter didn't just block cold, it softened sound. Thick walls dulled the shriek of storms. Allowing sleep. That mattered more than we often admit. Exhaustion is deadly in winter. There's a subtle social calculation happening too. You aren't building for one person. You're building for many. Families, servants, guests, sometimes animals. A longhouse is not private. And yet, privacy is a luxury you can't afford. The shared warmth of bodies, breathing together through the night, becomes part of the heating system. This isn't poetic exaggeration. Human body heat, multiplied, mattered. Some scholars suggest that early longhouses were even longer than necessary, simply to maximize shared warmth during extreme cold snaps. Others push back, arguing that length was more about social hierarchy and communal life than temperature alone. The debate remains open, and you can feel both arguments tugging at the beams you imagine lifting into place. You glance toward the horizon. Daylight already feels fragile. In deep winter, the sun barely rises, skimming the sky like an afterthought. This knowledge presses urgency into every movement. You don't just build for now. You build for weeks of darkness, when mistakes cannot be fixed easily. There's another curious detail whispered through sagas and reconstructed experiments. Some early builders intentionally left small gaps in the first winter, allowing the structure to settle, shrink, and shift before sealing it fully the following season. It meant enduring one harsher winter to guarantee many safer ones later. That kind of patience feels almost alien today. As you step back from the imagined foundation, you sense that this house will not be finished quickly. But it doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be forgiving, flexible, able to breathe without freezing you, able to hold smoke without choking you, able to shelter life. Noise, arguments, laughter, fear, and long silences under one roof. You straighten slowly, shoulders stiff from cold. The first decision has been made, not how beautiful the house will be, but where it belongs. In this land, placement is destiny. And as the wind brushes past again, testing your resolve, you understand why Vikings never treated shelter as an afterthought. It was the beginning of everything. You remain close to the ground, because standing upright for too long lets the wind push straight through your clothing. Down here, closer to earth, you begin to notice patterns. Snow does not settle evenly. Some patches remain strangely bare, while others gather thick drifts even before winter fully arrives. Vikings watched this carefully. Snow was not just cold decoration. It was information. You trace the slope of the land with your eyes. Cold air sinks. Warm air rises. Even in a world that feels endlessly frozen. If you place a house in a shallow hollow, cold will pool around it like water in a bowl. This is not theory. This is lived knowledge, passed along after nights spent shivering despite heavy walls. A mainstream historical understanding is that longhouses were often built on slight rises, gentle enough to avoid wind exposure, but high enough to let cold air drain away. You test the ground with your boot. It is firm but not brittle. Good soil matters more than you might expect. Too sandy, and posts shift. Too wet, and rot arrives early. Too rocky, and digging becomes a slow battle against iron-hard resistance. Builders learn to read the earth the way sailors read the sea. Color, smell, moisture, resistance. All clues. Wind returns again. This time in a low howl. You turn instinctively. And in that movement, you understand something else Vikings noticed. Wind does not come from everywhere. It favors directions. In many Scandinavian regions, winter winds pushed consistently from the north or west. Longhouses were positioned so their narrow ends faced that force. Less surface area meant less heat loss and less structural stress. This was not superstition. It was adaptation. There is a quieter detail here that often gets overlooked. Sound travels differently depending on placement. A house tucked just below a ridge hears less of the storm. The hill breaks the noise. Inside, this mattered. Sleep was survival. If you could rest through a storm instead of lying awake listening to timber strain and snow scrape, you woke stronger. You crouch again and pick up a handful of grass. Still green beneath the frost. Vegetation mattered too. Thick grass meant turf later. Turf was insulation waiting to happen. Areas stripped bare by wind were avoided. Vikings preferred land that offered materials close by. Carrying heavy sod across long distances in winter was exhausting and dangerous. There is a quirky tradition whispered in regional lore. In some settlements, elders would observe how animals behaved before choosing a building site. Where livestock naturally huddled during cold snaps was considered safer ground. Historians still argue whether this practice was symbolic storytelling or genuinely influential. But animal behavior often reflects subtle environmental advantages humans miss. You notice water now, a stream nearby, partially iced over, close enough for drinking, far enough to avoid flooding. This balance was crucial. Some early longhouses failed simply because spring melt turned floors into shallow swamps. Builders learned quickly. Distance from water was measured in steps, not maps. The idea of convenience barely exists yet. Every choice is filtered through winter logic. Can you reach this place in deep snow? Can you clear drifts without exposing walls too much? Will smoke rise cleanly or get trapped by nearby slopes? These questions shape the footprint long before the first post is set. There is debate among scholars about how much planning was conscious and how much was instinctive. Some argue that Vikings relied on accumulated tradition rather than deliberate analysis. Others suggest that experienced builders actively evaluated sites with impressive precision. Standing here, cold biting at your fingers, the distinction feels less important. Knowledge gained through repetition becomes instinct. You feel the sky lowering. Clouds press down, thick and heavy. In winter, light is rare and precious. A house placed poorly might lose what little daylight exists. Longhouses often aligned, so doorways and small openings could catch the low arc of the winter sun. This did not make interiors bright, but it made them survivable. Dim light helps regulate time when days blur together. There is another subtle factor you begin to appreciate. Smell. Smoke and human presence linger. A poorly placed house traps odors and dampness. A well-placed one lets air move slowly, exchanging without stealing warmth. This balance mattered more than comfort. Stale air meant sickness. Vikings did not know germs, but they knew when a house made people weak. You shift your weight and feel fatigue already. Building would not begin tomorrow or even next week. This stage took time. Walking, watching, waiting through weather changes. The land revealed itself slowly. Snow patterns changed. Winds shifted slightly. Meltwater traced hidden channels. Rushing meant regret. One mainstream archaeological observation supports this patience. Post holes from abandoned longhouses are often found near better positioned replacements, suggesting that early attempts taught lessons that shaped later construction. Mistakes were part of the process. Survival improved incrementally. There is a strange comfort in this. You are not expected to get everything right immediately. You are expected to pay attention. That is the real skill. Not strength, not speed. Attention. As the cold deepens, you imagine the future walls here. You imagine snow leaning against them, not crashing into them. You imagine smoke rising into still air instead of being slammed back inside. You imagine children sleeping without waking every hour from the sound of wind tearing at the roof. This place feels quieter, not silent, but calmer. The land itself seems to cooperate. That cooperation is the goal. Vikings did not conquer winter. They negotiated with it. You take one last look around. The decision settles in your chest. Steady and unglamorous. This is where the house will grow. Not because it is beautiful, but because it gives you a fighting chance when beauty no longer matters. And as the first snow begins to fall more heavily, you already sense that the next step will not be about land at all, but about scale. How big the shelter must become when survival is shared. You do not think small when winter is the enemy. Standing on chosen ground, you begin to sense that a tiny shelter would be a mistake. Not because it would collapse, but because it would isolate. Cold thrives on separation. Vikings learned early that warmth multiplies when lives overlap. The idea of building long rather than wide did not come from pride or display. It came from arithmetic. Fewer exterior walls meant fewer places for heat to leak away. A stretched structure also allowed many people to live under one roof without fragmenting the fire. One central hearth could serve dozens. This principle appears again and again in excavated foundations across Scandinavia, quietly confirming that size itself was a tool for survival. You imagine the outline now, narrow enough that the roof can be supported without massive beams, yet long enough to hold sleeping platforms, work areas, storage, animals, and movement. The proportions feel almost organic, like a body stretched out to conserve warmth under heavy furs. There is something counterintuitive here. Modern instinct says smaller spaces are easier to heat. Viking experience suggested otherwise. A cramped house traps smoke, moisture, and illness. A longer house breathes. Air moves slowly from one end to the other. Smoke thins. Dampness dries. Heat lingers without choking the people inside. You picture the interior filling gradually. Not all at once. First a family, then another. Perhaps hired hands. Maybe a visiting trader delayed by weather. The longhouse is designed to absorb people without becoming chaotic. Space is flexible. Sleeping areas shift. Tools move. No room is fixed forever. Some reconstruction experiments hint at an unexpected benefit. The sheer length of the structure allowed temperature gradients. Areas closer to the hearth stayed warmer. Cooler zones formed toward the ends. This gave inhabitants choice. Those working could stay alert in cooler air. Those resting could settle near the fire. Comfort became adjustable without changing the building itself. There is a detail that often surprises people. These houses were not quiet. They were full of sound, breathing, shifting bodies, wood popping as it adjusted to heat, animals stirring. Yet that noise was comforting. Silence meant danger. Silence meant storms muffled outside or snow piling without warning. Inside, noise meant life continuing. Some sagas exaggerate longhouse size to almost mythical proportions, while archaeology rarely supports such extremes. It does suggest that some houses were far larger than strictly necessary for daily use. One interpretation proposes that this excess space allowed communities to shelter together during particularly brutal winters or food shortages. Another view suggests that size reinforced social bonds and hierarchy. The truth may sit somewhere between warmth and status. You feel the scale settling in your body now. This is not a place of solitude. Privacy dissolves in favor of resilience. If someone wakes coughing, everyone hears. If someone rises early to tend the fire, everyone benefits. Individual survival merges into collective rhythm. You imagine sleeping here. Not alone. Never alone. Bodies aligned along walls. Feet toward the central aisle. Warmth radiates outward. Breath fogs the air. Then clears slowly as heat builds. It is not luxury. It is functional comfort. Animals enter the picture naturally. Sheep, goats, sometimes cattle, not wandering freely, but contained at one end or behind low partitions. Their presence adds warmth and smell and sound. It also adds risk, disease, accidents. But winter makes trade-offs unavoidable. Many settlements accepted these risks because the heat gained outweighed the discomfort. There is a lesser-known aspect of length that emerges in later analysis. Longhouses allowed for expansion without dismantling the original structure. Additional bays could be added at the ends as families grew. This meant a house could evolve across generations, preserving memory in timber and soil. Children grew up sleeping where grandparents once had. You run a hand along an imagined wall, feeling where beams would stand. Each post anchors more than wood. It anchors habit. The length of the house shapes how people move, where they pause, where they gather. Over time, paths wear into the floor. Places of conversation form without planning. Some modern observers assume such communal living was chaotic. Evidence suggests otherwise. Order emerged organically. Social roles defined spaces more than walls did. Near the hearth belonged to elders and guests. Farther zones took on quieter functions. No signs needed. Everyone knew. There is disagreement among researchers about whether longhouses were always this communal, or if some regions favoured more segmented layouts. Finds in certain coastal areas hint at internal divisions that may have offered limited privacy. Other sites show completely open interiors. Climate, culture, and available materials all seem to have influenced these choices. You consider how winter compresses time. Days blur. Tasks repeat. A longhouse stretches time sideways, allowing many activities to coexist without conflict. Someone repairs nets while another cooks. Someone sleeps while another sharpens tools. The house absorbs these rhythms quietly. There is also the psychological effect. A large, shared space reduces fear. Storms feel less threatening when many people hear the same wind and feel the same walls hold. Loneliness becomes rare. Tension increases. Yes, but winter values company over calm. You imagine a night when the storm peaks. Snow slams against the outer walls. Roof beams flex. Inside, the fire glows steadily. No one panics. This house was built for this moment. Length spreads stress. Pressure distributes. What might crush a smaller shelter merely groans here. As you stand in the imagined center aisle, warmth rising slowly, it becomes clear that size is not excess. It is strategy. The longhouse is large because winter is relentless. It is long because survival stretches time and patience. Soon, attention will shift from size to substance, from shape to material. Wood itself will decide how well this shelter holds when the cold truly arrives. Once the size is decided, your focus shifts from shape to substance. Wood is not just a building material here. It is a living thing that remembers where it came from. You feel that immediately when you picture the first trees being chosen. Not every tree is equal. Some bend, some split, some rot from the inside long before they fall. In these northern lands, trees grow slowly. Rings are tight. Fibers are dense. This makes the timber strong, but it also makes it temperamental. Freshly cut wood behaves very differently from wood that has dried for years. Vikings understood this through experience rather than theory. Green timber shrinks as it dries, sometimes dramatically, build carelessly. And gaps appear right when winter needs walls to be tight. Evidence from preserved post holes and surviving wooden fragments suggests that builders often used timber soon after cutting. Not because it was ideal, but because waiting was not always an option. Winter did not pause while wood cured. Instead, construction techniques adapted. Joints allowed movement. Walls accepted settling as part of their life cycle. You imagine lifting a beam still heavy with moisture. It smells sharp and clean. Almost sweet. That scent will linger inside the longhouse for months. Over time, as fires burn and smoke curls upward, the wood darkens, hardens, and becomes less reactive. Heat slowly drives out remaining moisture, tightening the structure from the inside. There is an often overlooked advantage here. Greenwood is easier to work. Tools bite more cleanly. Peg holes cut smoother. In freezing temperatures, seasoned wood can split unpredictably. Fresh timber flexes instead of shattering. This mattered when fingers were numb and mistakes costly. Builders selected different trees for different roles. Thick trunks became posts. Straighter lengths formed roof supports. Thinner branches filled walls. Birch, pine, spruce, oak, where available. Each carried its own strengths and weaknesses. Coastal regions favored driftwood when forests were scarce. Inland settlements relied on careful forest management, cutting selectively to avoid exhausting resources. A small but fascinating detail emerges in tool marks. Some beams show signs of being shaped only on the side facing inward. The outward face was left rough, hidden behind turf or clay. This saved effort and preserved strength. It also reveals a mindset focused on function over appearance. Beauty existed, but it was secondary to warmth. You run your hand along an imagined interior wall. The surface is uneven. Knots protrude slightly. Splinters are smoothed where hands pass often. This texture matters. Smooth walls invite drafts. Rough surfaces trap tiny pockets of still air. Even imperfections serve a purpose. There is discussion among modern wood specialists about whether Vikings intentionally exploited these properties or simply accepted them. Some argue that choices were deliberate, refined through generations. Others suggest that adaptation emerged naturally from trial and error. Standing here, surrounded by the imagined scent of sap and smoke, the distinction feels blurred. Knowledge gained through repetition becomes wisdom regardless of intent. You think about rot. Moisture is the enemy long after cold retreats. To fight it, posts were sometimes set on stone pads rather than directly into soil, where stone was scarce. Builders charred the ends of posts before burying them. This created a protective layer, slowing decay. The technique appears across multiple sites, hinting at shared understanding rather than coincidence. There is a strange comfort in how wood responds to fire. Not immediately, but over time. Smoke seeps into fibers, creating a natural preservative. Interiors grow darker each year, but stronger too. Fire marks the house as lived in. Seasoned. Less vulnerable. You notice that wood also holds sound. Thick beams soften echoes. Creaks become familiar signals rather than alarms. A sharp crack means a log shifting harmlessly. A dull thud suggests snow sliding from the roof. Over time, you learn the language of your own shelter. Some reconstructions reveal that longhouses were built with slightly inward-leaning walls. This was not a mistake. The angle helped counter roof weight and snow load. It also reduced exposed surface area at the top, where heat loss is greatest. Wood allowed this flexibility. Stone would have resisted such subtle shaping. There is debate about whether these angles were planned from the start or emerged as walls settled unevenly. Measurements vary. Some houses remain remarkably symmetrical. Others show gentle distortion. Either way, the structure adapted without failing. That resilience mattered more than precision. You picture winter tightening its grip. The wood responds. It contracts, creaks, then settles. Gaps appear briefly, then close as humidity shifts. Clay and turf in the walls compensate. The house breathes without collapsing. There is a quieter emotional aspect to this material choice. Wood feels warm even when cold. Touching it does not steal heat as aggressively as stone. In long nights, when hands brush walls while moving through darkness, that difference matters. Comfort is not luxury here. It is endurance. You imagine children tracing grain patterns with their fingers. Adults leaning tools against posts worn smooth by years of contact. Wood records life subtly. Scratches remain. Smoke stains accumulate. Each mark is a season survived. Some researchers propose that timber selection followed ritual as much as practicality. Certain trees were favored for symbolic reasons tied to belief systems. Others caution against reading too much spirituality into practical choices. The evidence is incomplete. What remains clear is that wood was respected, not wasted. As the imagined walls rise higher, you sense that this house will change with time. Wood allows that. Repairs are possible. Beams can be replaced. Additions can be made. A wooden house grows old with its people rather than resisting age. Soon, attention will turn to how these wooden bones are wrapped and protected. Walls alone are not enough. Winter finds every weakness. And the next layer of defense will come from earth itself. Once the wooden frame stands steady, you begin to understand that wood alone will never be enough. Winter finds gaps with patient certainty. Air slips through seams you did not notice. Heat rises and disappears. The answer is not thicker planks, but layers. Protection comes from stacking different materials until cold loses its advantage. You move closer to the walls. imagining how they are built outward rather than inward. The inner surface remains wood, warm to the touch and forgiving. The outer layers become something else entirely. Turf, clay, packed earth, materials gathered from the same ground that tested you earlier. Nothing is decorative. Everything has weight and purpose. Archaeological remains consistently show that Viking longhouse walls were composite structures. Timber frames formed the skeleton, but the flesh came from sod cut into dense blocks. These were stacked tightly. Grass side outward, roots interlocking. Over time, the living layer continued to grow, sealing cracks and shedding water. The house slowly became part of the landscape. You imagine lifting turf blocks. They are heavy, damp, and cold even before winter deepens. Carrying them is slow work. Fingers ache, back strain. But once placed, they offer something wood cannot. Mass, thickness, stillness. Cold moves slowly through earth. By the time it reaches the inner wall, it has lost much of its strength. Clay enters the picture as binder and sealant, mixed with straw, dung, or ash. It fills gaps between timbers and turf. When dry, it hardens. When damp, it swells slightly, closing cracks rather than opening them. This flexibility mattered when temperatures swung wildly between freeze and thaw. You press your palm against an imagined finished wall. It does not feel thin. It feels solid, almost like a hillside. Sound dulls. Wind noise fades. Inside, the air feels calmer. This is not insulation in the modern sense. It is inertia. Heat stays because it has nowhere easy to go. There is an understated advantage to turf walls that people often miss. Snow piles against them instead of sliding away. This is intentional. Snow adds insulation. A drift leaning against a wall creates a barrier of trapped air. Instead of clearing it away, inhabitants often let it build, turning winter itself into a shield. Some reconstructed longhouses show evidence that outer walls were periodically repaired with fresh turf as old layers dried or eroded. This was not failure. It was maintenance. Walls were living systems, not finished products. Each spring and autumn brought small adjustments, ensuring readiness for the next cold season. A curious detail appears in some sites. Stones embedded within turf layers, not for strength, but for weight. Wind could peel poorly anchored sod away. Added mass kept walls intact during storms. The stones also absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, adding subtle thermal stability. You notice how low the walls remain. Height is sacrificed deliberately. Less wall surface means less heat loss. The roof begins lower than expected, forcing people to stoop slightly. This is inconvenient but survivable. Freezing is not. There is discussion among modern builders who study these structures about airflow. Some argue that such thick walls risk trapping moisture inside. Others point out that small gaps near the roofline allowed slow ventilation without dramatic heat loss. The truth seems to lie in balance. Too sealed, and dampness sickens. Too open, and cold conquers. You picture smoke drifting upward from the hearth, brushing along rafters before escaping slowly. Walls absorb some of it, darkening and strengthening over time. The smell becomes familiar, almost comforting. Smoke drives away insects, preserves wood, and reminds everyone that fire is alive. There is a lesser-known practice hinted at in regional traditions. Some builders mixed crushed shells or sand into clay layers. This reduced cracking and improved durability. Whether this was widespread or localized remains uncertain, but examples appear often enough to suggest experimentation rather than accident. You step back mentally and view the house from outside. It no longer looks like a wooden building. It looks like a mound. Earth tones dominate. Grass waves gently on the surface. In winter, snow smooths everything into a single shape. From a distance, the structure almost disappears. This had defensive advantages too. A house that blends into land is harder to spot in storms or conflict. Inside, the difference is immediate. Sound softens. Temperature stabilizes. The fire does not have to fight constantly. It simply maintains. This reduces fuel consumption, which matters deeply when gathering wood in deep snow is dangerous and exhausting. You imagine a night when wind howls across the landscape. Outside, trees bend and snap. Snow scours the ground. Inside, you hear little more than a low murmur. Walls hold. Heat remains. People sleep. There is disagreement among historians about whether turf walls were universal or region-specific. Some inland areas relied more heavily on timber due to available forests. Coastal regions favored turf due to limited trees. The result was variation, not uniformity. Viking architecture was adaptable rather than standardized. You feel appreciation growing for this layered approach. Each material compensates for another's weakness. Wood provides structure. Earth provides mass. Clay provides seal. Snow provides insulation. Nothing works alone. Survival comes from cooperation. Just like the people inside, children grow up touching these walls, leaning against them, sleeping beside them. They learn early that warmth comes from thickness and patience, not speed. Repairs are not resented. They are part of seasonal rhythm. As you imagine winter deepening, walls darkening with smoke and age, you realize that the house is no longer simply built. It is growing. It changes slowly, quietly, adapting to those who live within it. Next, your attention will lift upward. Walls hold warmth, but the roof decides whether the house survives snow itself, and snow is heavier than it looks. When you look up, you understand why the roof matters more than any wall. Snow does not drift gently here. It piles. It presses. It waits for weakness. A flat roof would be a slow disaster. Vikings learned this early, sometimes at terrible cost. The angle of the roof becomes the first defense, steep enough to encourage snow to slide away, but not so steep that wind tears coverings loose. This balance took experimentation. Early attempts likely failed often. Collapsed roofs leave clear traces in the archaeological record, reminding you that learning came with loss. You picture long rafters rising from the walls, meeting at a ridge beam that runs the length of the house. This central spine carries much of the weight. Shorter rafters lean into it, creating a strong triangular form. Triangles resist collapse better than rectangles. This geometry appears again and again in surviving foundations and reconstructions. Snow behaves strangely. Fresh snowfall is light, but repeated storms compress layers into heavy slabs. Wet snow is especially dangerous. Roof pitch needed to shed this weight before it became crushing. Many longhouses used angles between 30 and 45 degrees, enough to let gravity assist without exposing too much surface to the wind. You imagine standing inside during a storm, listening. The sound of snow sliding off the roof is not alarming. It is reassuring. A soft rush, a dull thump as it lands outside. Silence would be worse. Silence might mean weight building silently above your head. The roof covering itself was just as important as its angle. Wooden shingles were rare in early Viking contexts. Instead, builders relied on layers of birch bark, straw, reeds, and turf. Birch bark was particularly valuable. It repelled water while remaining flexible in cold. Laid carefully, it formed a waterproof skin beneath heavier layers. You picture the process. Bark sheets peeled in spring, dried, stored. Come building season, they are overlapped like scales, directing water downward. Above them, thick layers of turf add mass and insulation. The roof becomes heavy. Yes, but stable. Weight presses the structure together rather than pulling it apart. There is a common misunderstanding that turf roofs were weak. In reality, their mass protected the house from wind. Light roofs lift. Heavy roofs settle. The trick was making sure the supporting beams could carry the load. Posts were thick. Spacing was deliberate. Everything pointed toward endurance rather than elegance. Some reconstructions show roofs extending low, nearly touching the ground on the sides. This reduced exposed wall area and guided wind over the house instead of into it. You would need to duck to enter. This inconvenience was minor compared to the benefit of reduced heat loss. Inside, the roof shape creates a high central space above the hearth. Smoke rises naturally, collecting under the ridge before escaping slowly. There is no chimney in the modern sense. Instead, small openings near the roofline allow smoke to seep out. Too large, and heat escapes. Too small, and air becomes dangerous. Finding this balance was critical. You imagine eyes stinging slightly, throats accustomed to thin smoke. Over time, people adapted. Smoke was unpleasant, but it kept insects away and preserved food and timber. Perfect air quality was not the goal. Survival was. There is a subtle advantage to steep roofs that is easy to miss. Snow that slides off creates banks around the house. These banks act as windbreaks. They also insulate the lower walls further. The house uses winter against itself, turning accumulation into protection. Some modern researchers question whether all Viking longhouses had such steep roofs. In milder regions, shallower angles appear. Climate dictated design. Builders did not follow rigid rules. They adjusted based on experience and environment. You feel the scale again. A long roof is heavy. It requires cooperation to build. Beams must be lifted together. Mistakes are costly. But once in place, the roof defines the house. Walls can be repaired. Floors can be reworked. A roof failure, however, is immediate and catastrophic. You imagine the quiet satisfaction of hearing rain instead of snow. Water beads and runs off. Birch bark channels it safely away. Turf absorbs and releases moisture slowly. Drips inside are rare and concerning when they appear. There is a lesser discussed practice that appears in some experimental builds. Roofs were sometimes weighted further, with stones placed strategically along the ridge or edges. This prevented wind from peeling layers away during storms. Whether this was common practice or situational remains unclear, but it reflects the same logic as weighted walls. You think about maintenance again. Roofs demanded attention. Turf dried and cracked. Animals might graze too aggressively. Repairs happened seasonally. A neglected roof invited collapse. A cared-for one lasted decades. Inside, the roof influences daily life. Light filters down unevenly. Shadows stretch and shrink with the fire. Sound changes. A low roof muffles echoes, creating intimacy. Voices do not travel far. This keeps nights calm. Conversations close. There is disagreement among scholars about how smoky these interiors truly were. Some argue that conditions would have been unbearable. Others point to evidence of long-term habitation without signs of chronic respiratory damage. Adaptation likely played a role. People became accustomed. Houses improved slowly. You imagine lying down, eyes half closed, listening to wind skim over the roof instead of battering it. That sound is different. It is smoother. The roof has done its job. As winter deepens, snow slides, builds, and settles again. The roof holds. It flexes slightly, but remains strong. Beneath it, life continues with a fragile sense of safety. Next, your attention will return inward, toward the fire that makes all of this worthwhile. Without heat, even the best roof means nothing. When you step outside and look at the finished roof, it no longer feels like a separate structure. It looks like part of the hillside itself. Grass ripples where shingles might be in another world. Soil darkens where rain has passed. In winter, snow smooths every edge until the house almost disappears into the land. This was not accidental. Turf roofing was a deliberate choice shaped by centuries of experience. Earth insulates better than air alone. It slows temperature change. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it gradually when the night tightens its grip. For people facing months of cold, this mattered more than appearance. You imagine climbing onto the roof in early autumn. The turf is soft underfoot, damp and resilient. Roots knit the surface together. preventing erosion. The weight presses downward evenly, locking the roof layers into place. Wind rushes overhead, but it cannot lift what is anchored by mass. There is clear evidence from excavations that turf roofs were common across many Viking settlements, though thickness varied by region. In colder inland areas, roofs carried heavier sod layers. In milder coastal zones, they were thinner. Climate-shaped construction in quiet, practical ways. You consider the warmth below. Heat rises, but earth resists. Instead of escaping quickly, warmth lingers beneath the turf, spreading slowly. This reduces the need for constant fire. Less fuel burned means fewer dangerous trips into snowy forests. Efficiency becomes safety. There is a small but telling detail preserved in some reconstructions. The edges of turf roofs were often planted intentionally with grasses or low plants. Their roots reinforced the structure. Their growth repaired minor damage. The roof became self-maintaining to a degree, healing itself after storms. Some traditions suggest that children were warned not to play roughly on the roof during winter thaws. Softening turf could slip. A fall from even a low roof could injure. This reveals something important. These roofs were used spaces. People walked on them, inspected them, trusted them. You imagine standing there at dusk, looking out over snow-covered land, feeling warmth rise faintly through your boots. The house breathes beneath you, alive in its own way. There is debate about whether turf roofs increased moisture problems inside. Some argue that trapped dampness would have been difficult to manage. Others point out that the slow ventilation through smoke openings balanced humidity. Evidence of long-term habitation suggests that whatever problems existed were manageable. You notice how the roof changes sound. Rain becomes a soft tapping. Snow muffles everything. Wind becomes a low sigh. Inside, storms feel distant. This psychological effect cannot be overstated. Fear drains energy. Calm preserves it. You step back inside now, lowering yourself through the doorway. Warmth greets you gradually. Not sudden heat, but steady comfort. The difference between inside and outside is clear but not shocking. This moderation protects the body. Extreme temperature swings exhaust people. The turf roof also influences light. Interiors remain dim, especially in winter. Firelight dances against curved surfaces. Shadows move slowly. This darkness encourages rest. Activity slows naturally. People adapt to the rhythm imposed by their shelter. There is a lesser-known benefit to earth-covered roofs. They provide camouflage. In stormy weather, a longhouse blends into surroundings. Smoke dissipates close to the ground. From a distance, nothing signals habitation clearly. This may have offered subtle protection in times of conflict or raiding. Some scholars question whether this concealment was intentional or incidental. The evidence is mixed. What remains clear is that the design had multiple advantages, whether planned or discovered. You think again about weight. A turf roof is heavy. It demands strong support. This reinforces earlier decisions about thick posts and closely spaced rafters. Each choice supports another. Nothing stands alone. You imagine the maintenance cycle. In spring, damaged turf is replaced. Roots are pressed back into soil. In summer, growth thickens. In autumn, loose sections are secured. Winter arrives with a roof prepared to carry snow. This rhythm becomes part of life. Roof care is not a separate chore. It is seasonal awareness. The house teaches attention. You hear a muffled sound above. Snow sliding again. The roof accepts it, guides it, releases it. Below, you barely notice. There is something deeply calming about this relationship between shelter and environment. Instead of fighting winter, the house accommodates it. Earth against earth, weight against wind, warmth held gently rather than forced. You imagine lying near the hearth, eyes half closed, listening to the distant hush of weather above layers of soil and grass. This is not luxury. It is security built from patience. As you drift mentally through this space, you sense that one more element remains central. Walls and roofs hold warmth. but fire gives it life. The heart of the longhouse waits in the center. You move toward the center of the longhouse, guided less by sight and more by warmth. This is where everything converges. The hearth is not placed for beauty or ceremony. It sits here because heat spreads best from the middle. Cold retreats outward. People gather inward. The fire becomes the quiet organizer of life. You crouch and imagine the hearth as it would have been, not a raised fireplace, not enclosed by stone walls, but a long, shallow pit lined with stones and packed earth. Flames burn low and steady rather than tall and dramatic. This conserves fuel and keeps sparks from leaping dangerously toward the roof. Ash builds gradually. It is not swept away constantly. A thin layer insulates embers, helping the fire restart easily in the morning. You understand now why losing fire was so feared. Without flame, the longhouse becomes just another cold space. With it, the house lives. There is strong agreement among historians that the hearth was the social and thermal heart of the Viking home. Meals were cooked here. Tools were repaired here. Stories passed through this space, carried by voices softened by smoke. Even sleep patterns revolved around distance from the fire. You imagine sitting near it as night deepens. Heat brushes your face while your back remains cool. You shift position instinctively. People learned to read the fire the way sailors read wind. A hotter burn meant colder weather outside. A weaker flame signaled fuel conservation or warmer nights. The fire also shaped time. Without clocks, days were measured by how often fuel was added. Nights stretched longer in winter. People slept in phases, waking to tend embers, then resting again. The hearth anchored these cycles. There is a detail that often surprises modern listeners. The fire rarely burned continuously at full strength. It smoldered. It breathed. Flames rose when needed, then settled. This reduced smoke and saved wood. Maintaining this balance required attention and skill passed down through observation. Smoke rises, but not cleanly. It curls along rafters, then drifts toward small openings near the roof. Some escapes through gaps in turf and bark. Some lingers. Your eyes sting slightly at first. Over time, you adjust. So does the house. Soot coats wood, sealing it. Insects avoid the space. Food dries slowly overhead. Some reconstructions suggest that meat and fish were hung high in the rafters, benefiting from both smoke and warmth. This preserved food through winter. The hearth fed bodies directly and indirectly, sustaining life long after flames died down. You feel the floor beneath you now. It is packed earth, warmest near the fire. Over time, feet compress it smooth. Spilled water dries quickly. Spilled grease darkens patches. The ground records daily life quietly. There is debate about how dangerous indoor fires truly were. Some argue that smoke inhalation must have caused illness. Others point to long-term habitation evidence and suggest adaptation. What seems clear is that people balanced risk against necessity. Fire was dangerous, but cold was deadly. You notice how seating forms naturally around the hearth. Low benches, sleeping platforms beyond, tools leaning against posts within reach of light. The fire defines zones without walls. Children learn early where it is safe to step. Elders sit closest during cold spells. Guests are offered warmer spots as a sign of respect. Social order radiates outward from heat. There is a lesser discussed emotional role played by the hearth. In long winters, firelight provides movement when everything else feels frozen. Flames flicker. Shadows dance. This motion comforts the mind. Stillness outside is broken inside. You imagine storms raging beyond turf walls. Inside, the fire answers with steady sound. Crackling. Hissing sap. A low murmur that reassures without demanding attention. Fuel becomes precious. Wood is gathered carefully, often dried near the hearth before burning. Damp wood smokes too much. Dry wood burns too fast. Finding the right balance becomes routine knowledge. Some regions supplemented wood with peat or dried dung. These burned slower, producing more smoke but conserving timber. The smell was strong but familiar. Survival rarely smells pleasant. You picture someone waking before dawn, feeding the embers gently, not to create flame, but to prevent cold from returning fully. This quiet act protects everyone sleeping nearby. Responsibility rotates. No one is exempt. There is disagreement among researchers about whether longhouses had multiple hearths. Most evidence points to one central fire. A single source simplified ventilation and encouraged gathering. Multiple fires increased risk. You notice how the roof responds to heat. Warm air rises, meets cooler turf, then settles back downward. This circulation spreads warmth evenly. The house becomes a slow-breathing organism. As hours pass, ash thickens. Someone scrapes it aside, revealing glowing embers. Heat returns instantly. Fire does not need to be rebuilt. It only needs attention. You feel the calm this creates. Even as wind presses outside, inside life continues predictably. The hearth anchors routine. Routine anchors sanity. As you settle near the fire, eyes heavy, you realize that everything else in the longhouse serves this space. Walls protect it. Roof shelters it. People orbit it. And yet, fire alone is not enough. Smoke must leave. Air must move. The balance between warmth and breath is delicate. Soon, attention will shift upward again, to the unseen pathways that keep people alive while the fire burns. You begin to notice that warmth alone does not make a space livable. Breathing matters just as much. As the fire burns steadily, smoke thickens the air, curling along the roof before slowly finding its way out. Managing this invisible movement becomes one of the most delicate skills inside the longhouse. There is no chimney rising cleanly above the roof. Instead, smoke escapes through small openings near the ridge or through gaps intentionally left between roof layers. These are not mistakes. They are carefully judged compromises. Too open, and precious heat disappears. Too sealed, and air becomes heavy and dangerous. You sit quietly and feel how the air moves. Warmth lifts smoke upward. Cool air slides inward near the floor. This slow circulation refreshes the space without sudden drafts. People learn to recognize when balance was off. Burning eyes, coughing, or lingering haze signaled the need for adjustment. One commonly accepted understanding is that longhouse builders relied on stack effect long before the concept had a name. Hot air rising pulled fresh air in. This natural flow required patience. Fires were kept low. Sudden bursts of flame disrupted balance. You imagine someone nudging a roof flap slightly wider during a smoky evening. Not much. Just enough. The house responds gradually. Smoke thins. Heat remains. This constant tuning becomes second nature, like adjusting a blanket during sleep. There is a fascinating detail observed in some reconstructed buildings. Smoke stains concentrate in predictable patterns along rafters and near openings. These marks reveal airflow paths used repeatedly over years. The house teaches its inhabitants where air prefers to move. Some longhouses incorporated small vents near doorways or at ground level. These allowed fresh air to enter without creating strong drafts. Cold air hugged the floor, warming slowly as it traveled inward. People sleeping on raised platforms avoided the worst chill. You notice how smell behaves. Smoke carries scent, food, people, animals. Over time, these odors blend into something familiar, not pleasant, but comforting. A lived-in smell. It signals safety. There is discussion among modern scholars about how much smoke exposure people tolerated. Some argue conditions must have been harsh. Others point out that lung adaptation and intermittent exposure likely reduced harm. Evidence of long-term habitation suggests that while uncomfortable, the balance was workable. You think about children growing up in this environment, eyes watering at first, then adjusting, bodies learning what normal feels like. Complaints fade. Habituation replaces discomfort. There is also the matter of fire safety. Sparks are dangerous. To reduce risk, hearths were often surrounded by stones that absorbed heat. Roof timbers above were sometimes spaced wider to reduce ignition risk. Smoke darkened wood, making it less flammable over time. You hear a faint whistle now as wind outside shifts. Air pressure changes. Smoke momentarily pushes downward before correcting itself. This reminds you that ventilation is never static. Weather influences everything. Storms force smoke back inside. Calm nights let it drift upward easily. During severe weather, people tolerated heavier smoke to preserve heat. Breathing became shallow. Eyes stung. It was temporary. Cold outside was worse. Some oral traditions mention opening doors briefly to clear air. Even in deep winter, this was done carefully, quickly, with people wrapped tightly. The rush of cold shocked the room, but fresh air restored balance. Doors were closed again. Heat slowly returned. You imagine how sound changes when doors open. Wind roars, snow scrapes, then silence again as turf walls resume their work. The house feels almost alive, responding to small interventions. There is a subtle architectural choice here. Doorways are low and narrow. This reduces air exchange. Cold air stays low. Warm air stays high. Movement in and out is controlled. You picture someone entering late at night, stooping, shaking snow from boots. Cold air spills briefly across the floor. People near the fire feel it, but only faintly. Walls and roof absorb the intrusion. Some researchers propose that smoke also acted as pest control, discouraging insects and rodents. This reduced disease risk and preserved food stores. The discomfort of smoke came with benefits not immediately obvious. You begin to appreciate how breathing, warmth, and structure intertwine. The house is not sealed. It is regulated. That regulation requires awareness. There is no single correct setting. Conditions change hourly. People respond intuitively. Fire size shifts. Openings adjust. Routines flex. You sit back and imagine the long night stretching ahead. The fire glows low. Smoke thins. Air moves quietly. Outside, wind loses interest. Inside, breathing slows. This balance between heat and breath allows sleep. It allows life to continue without constant strain. Without it, even the strongest walls would fail their purpose. As your body relaxes, attention drifts from air to rest. The next concern is where warmth settles when eyes finally close. Sleep requires its own design, and in the longhouse, even sleeping is shaped by winter. As the night deepens, your attention drifts away from walls and fire and settles on where bodies finally rest. Sleeping in winter is not simply closing your eyes. It is positioning yourself within a carefully arranged landscape of warmth, sound, and safety. In the longhouse, sleep is communal, deliberate, and deeply practical. You move toward the raised platforms that line the walls. These are not beds in the modern sense. They are wide wooden benches, sometimes layered with straw, wool, or animal skins. Height matters. Cold air sinks. Warm air gathers higher. By sleeping off the floor, you escape the worst chill without needing extra fuel. You imagine lowering yourself onto one of these platforms. It is firm, not soft. Comfort comes from insulation rather than cushioning. Thick furs trap heat. Wool breathes. The combination keeps moisture from building, while warmth remains close to the body. There is a commonly accepted understanding that sleeping arrangements followed strict logic rather than preference. Elders and children slept closer to the fire. Those who worked hardest during the day often claimed warmer spots at night. Guests were offered places of honor near heat as a sign of hospitality. You notice how bodies align. People sleep side by side, feet toward the central aisle. This orientation allows warmth from the fire to reach everyone evenly. It also keeps pathways clear for night movement. Someone tending embers does not step over sleeping forms. Body heat becomes part of the heating system. One person warms another. Breath mingles. Blankets overlap. Privacy dissolves quietly in favor of shared survival. What might feel crowded elsewhere feels necessary here. You imagine the sounds of sleep, breathing, shifting weight, Occasional murmurs. Someone coughing lightly. These noises reassure. Silence would feel wrong. Silence might mean danger. There is evidence from wear patterns in excavated longhouses that sleeping areas were used consistently over long periods. Boards smooth with age. Soil compacted beneath platforms. These marks suggest routine rather than chaos. You think about darkness. Firelight fades late at night. Reduced to embers. The longhouse grows dim. Eyes adjust. Shapes soften. This darkness encourages rest. Activity slows naturally. Winter demands conservation of energy. Some people wake during the night. This is expected. Sleep comes in segments. Someone adds fuel. Someone steps outside briefly. Someone checks on animals. Then rest returns. No one resents this. It is part of the rhythm. There is discussion among researchers about whether people slept fully clothed. Evidence suggests that layers were kept on, loosened rather than removed. Removing clothing risked heat loss and stiffness. Comfort came from managing layers, not exposing skin. You feel the difference between sleeping near the wall and sleeping near the fire. Near the wall, air is cooler but more stable. Near the fire, warmth fluctuates with embers. Some prefer one, some the other. Choice exists within constraint. Children learn quickly where they belong. They drift toward warmth instinctively. Adults guide them gently, adjusting furs, pulling coverings closer. These small acts repeat nightly, building trust and routine. There is a quieter emotional effect here. Shared sleep reduces fear. Storms feel less threatening when others breathe nearby. Loneliness becomes rare. Tension exists. But winter teaches patience. Some oral accounts describe families singing softly or telling stories before sleep. Not loudly, but enough to ease minds. Sound carries differently at night. Words feel closer. Time stretches. You imagine lying still, eyes half closed, listening to the fire settle. Outside, snow presses against walls. Inside, warmth holds. The longhouse becomes a cocoon. There is debate about how restful this sleep truly was. Some argue conditions were too noisy or smoky. Others suggest that physical exhaustion made sleep come easily. Evidence of long-term survival suggests that rest, though imperfect, was sufficient. You feel your own breathing slow. The platform beneath you feels solid. Walls no longer feel distant. Everything is close. Contained. Animals stir faintly at the far end. Their warmth adds to the shared pool. Their sounds blend into the background. This proximity feels normal here. You notice how the roof above seems lower at night. Shadows press inward. This creates a sense of enclosure. Safety. Morning will come slowly. There is no sudden wake-up. Light seeps gradually. People rise in stages. Someone tends the fire. Someone stretches stiff limbs. Sleep loosens its grip reluctantly. But for now, night holds. Bodies rest. Heat remains. The longhouse does its quiet work. As you drift deeper into this imagined rest, you realize that sleeping arrangements are not separate from architecture. They are architecture in use. Every beam and wall shapes how rest happens. Soon, attention will shift again, not to rest, but to those who share this space with you through winter. Animals. Their presence changes everything. As the night settles fully, another presence makes itself known. You hear it before you see it. A soft shuffle, a low breath, the quiet sound of hooves shifting against packed earth. Animals are here too, sharing the longhouse through the hardest months of winter. This arrangement is not sentimental. It is practical. Livestock represent warmth, food, labor, and survival. Losing animals to cold would mean losing milk, meat, wool, and strength when spring finally arrives. Bringing them indoors is a calculated decision shaped by necessity rather than comfort. You imagine the far end of the longhouse, separated not by walls, but by low partitions or changes in floor level. Sheep cluster together. Goats settle close. Sometimes a cow or two stand quietly, their large bodies radiating heat into the space. The air here smells stronger, earthier. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar. One widely accepted observation from archaeological sites is that animal stalls were integrated directly into longhouse layouts. Drainage channels cut into the floor allowed waste to flow away from sleeping areas. Straw absorbed moisture. Regular maintenance kept conditions tolerable. You feel the difference in temperature immediately. Near the animals, the air is warmer. Their bodies release steady heat, especially valuable during the coldest nights. This warmth drifts slowly toward the center of the house, contributing to the overall balance. Animals also bring sound, occasional bleats, hoof steps, the low rumble of breath. These sounds become part of the night rhythm. They reassure rather than disturb. Silence from the animal end would cause concern. There is a lesser-known benefit to this proximity. Animals sense changes in weather. Restlessness often precedes storms. Their behavior provides early warning. People learn to listen. You imagine waking briefly to movement among the animals. A storm is coming. Someone rises to secure roof layers or adjust vents. The house responds before danger peaks. There is discussion among historians about whether keeping animals indoors increased disease risk. Some argue that close quarters must have led to illness. Others point out that smoke and cold reduced parasite survival, and that careful separation limited direct contact. Evidence of long-term habitation suggests that while risks existed, they were managed. You consider how children interact with animals in this space. They grow up accustomed to their presence. Responsibility begins early. Feeding, cleaning, monitoring. These tasks continue through winter, shaping daily routine. The floor beneath animals is slightly sloped. Waste drains away. Straw is replaced regularly. This is labor, but necessary labor. Neglect would poison the air and invite sickness. There is a subtle emotional comfort here too. Animals represent continuity. They are investments in the future. Hearing them breathe through the night reassures everyone that spring will matter. Some oral traditions suggest that certain animals were given names and treated with particular care during winter, whether widespread or localized. This hints at bonds formed through shared survival rather than affection alone. You notice how heat distribution changes with animals present. Warmth becomes more even. Cold pockets shrink. The longhouse feels fuller, more alive. You imagine the smell of hay mixing with smoke. It becomes the scent of winter life. Sharp, heavy, unmistakable. It clings to clothing and hair. It marks everyone as part of this place. There is also risk. Animals can panic. A sudden noise might cause movement that endangers people. Children learn quickly where it is safe to stand. Adults remain alert even while resting. Some researchers suggest that animal placement varied by region. In harsher climates, animals were kept closer. In milder areas, they might be housed separately. This flexibility reflects adaptation rather than rigid tradition. You think about feeding. Stored hay and grain must last through winter. Rations are calculated carefully. Overfeeding wastes resources. Underfeeding risks death. This balancing act continues daily. The animals, in turn, contribute resources even during winter. Milk may still flow. Wool can be cleaned and spun. Manure becomes fuel or fertilizer when spring arrives. Nothing is wasted. You imagine a particularly cold night. Frost creeps along the walls. Wind presses hard. Inside, animals huddle tighter. Heat rises. The house holds. There is something grounding about this shared existence. Humans and animals endure together. Comfort is secondary. Survival is shared. As your thoughts drift, the sounds of animals fade into the background. They become part of the longhouse breathing. In and out. Steady. This arrangement influences social boundaries. The far end of the house is functional rather than social. Conversations soften as they approach. Respect grows from necessity. You feel the night stretching again. time slows. Fire glows faintly. Bodies rest. Animals settle. Soon, attention will turn from warmth and sleep to the rhythm of daily work that continues even when snow lies deep. Winter does not stop life. It reshapes it. When morning arrives in winter, it does not announce itself clearly. Light seeps in slowly, diluted and pale, slipping through small openings and catching on smoke that never fully leaves the air. You wake without certainty of time. There is no sharp boundary between night and day. The Longhouse teaches you to read subtler signals. You sit up and notice how dim the space remains. Firelight still matters, even at midday. This is one of the quiet truths of northern winters. Darkness dominates. Light becomes a resource to manage carefully rather than something taken for granted. Small openings near the roof and doorway allow thin bands of daylight to enter. These are not windows in the modern sense. Glass is rare and precious. Instead, light arrives indirectly, filtered through smoke and turf. It is enough to move, to work, to recognize faces. It is never enough to waste. You learn quickly where light falls. Certain spots near the hearth brighten briefly when the sun sits low on the horizon. These places become favored for detailed tasks. Repairing tools, sewing, carving. People shift with the light instinctively, following it across the floor as the day passes. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that longhouse entrances were often positioned to capture as much winter light as possible without inviting wind. Doorways face carefully chosen directions. A few degrees matter. This attention to light helps maintain daily rhythm when daylight lasts only hours. You notice how darkness changes behavior. Movements slow. Voices soften. Energy is conserved. People do not rush. Winter rewards patience. Fire becomes a companion to light rather than just warmth. Flames illuminate faces from below, casting long shadows on walls and beams. Expressions appear stronger. Stories feel closer. Even routine conversations take on weight in flickering light. There is a lesser-known detail revealed by soot patterns. Areas used for fine work show lighter staining, suggesting they were positioned to receive better light and airflow. These subtle traces allow modern observers to map daily life long after voices fade. You imagine children learning to judge time by fire and light. They know when it is morning by how embers glow. They know when evening approaches by how shadows lengthen. This knowledge is embodied rather than taught. Darkness also shapes sleep. People rest more. Night extends. Without artificial lighting, bodies follow natural cycles more closely. This reduces strain. Winter becomes a season of inward focus. Some scholars suggest that extended darkness contributed to strong oral traditions. Storytelling filled the visual gap. Words painted images when eyes could not. This fits well with the longhouse environment, where sound carries gently and attention is shared. You think about how fear behaves in darkness. Unknown shapes loom. Sounds feel larger. The longhouse counters this by compressing space. Walls are close. People are near. Firelight moves. The mind settles. There is debate about whether Vikings suffered from seasonal melancholy. Evidence is indirect. What is clear is that architecture responded to psychological needs as much as physical ones. Warmth and light both mattered. You notice how tasks are organized around light availability. Heavy labor waits for brighter hours. Quiet work fills darker times. Winter imposes structure without words. You imagine standing near the doorway, watching snow reflect faint light back inside. Even moonlight matters. Snow brightens the world slightly, offering relief from complete darkness. Doors open rarely and briefly. Each opening risks losing heat and light. People plan movements carefully. Children learn not to linger. There is a comforting predictability to this. The longhouse buffers extremes. Darkness outside becomes manageable inside. You sit again, letting eyes adjust. Shapes emerge slowly. Familiar outlines of posts and beams reassure. This place is known. Known spaces reduce fear. As the day advances, fire is fed more often. Light increases. Smoke thins. Work resumes. You sense that managing light is not passive. It is an active skill. Positioning. Timing. Attention. Soon, the focus will shift to how food supports this winter existence. Light and warmth sustain daily life, but nourishment keeps bodies strong enough to endure the cold. As the dim winter day settles into its brief peak, attention turns naturally toward food. Warmth and light keep you alive, but nourishment keeps you moving. In winter, eating is not about variety or pleasure. It is about continuity. The longhouse becomes both kitchen and pantry, holding what was gathered months earlier with careful foresight. You imagine stores tucked along the walls, hanging from rafters, packed into chests, buried beneath platforms, dried fish stiff as wood, smoked meat darkened by months of fire, grain sealed in sacks, roots stored in cool corners. Each item represents summer labor preserved against winter hunger. There is solid archaeological support for this image. Excavations reveal storage pits, hooks, and containers integrated into living spaces. Food was kept close, not for convenience alone, but for protection. Cold preserves, but animals steal. Keeping supplies indoors ensured control. You feel the air near stored food. Dry, smoky, stable. Smoke does more than flavor. It slows decay. It discourages insects. Food hung high benefits from warm air rising from the hearth. Preservation happens gradually, invisibly. Meals are simple. Stews simmer slowly. Ingredients stretch. A pot near the fire warms for hours, releasing scent that fills the house. Eating becomes communal by necessity. Cooking for one makes little sense. Sharing reduces waste and spreads effort. You imagine sitting near the hearth as food is portioned. Bowls pass from hand to hand. Portions are fair, not generous. Everyone understands limits. Overeating today means hunger tomorrow. There is evidence that Vikings relied heavily on fish during winter. Cod and herring dried in summer could last months. Their protein sustained strength when fresh meat was scarce. Inland settlements depended more on preserved meat and grain. Diet followed geography. You notice how hunger sharpens awareness. People track stores mentally. How many days remain? How much fuel remains to cook? This calculation continues quietly in the background of every decision. There is a lesser discussed detail in some finds. Certain foods were stored within walls themselves. Hollow spaces filled with dried herbs or roots added insulation while keeping supplies accessible. Whether intentional or incidental, the result served both needs. Cooking techniques adapt to winter constraints. Boiling dominates. It requires less fuel than roasting. It uses tough cuts effectively. Stews extract nutrients slowly, maximizing value. You imagine the sound of a pot bubbling gently. Steam rises, adding moisture to dry air. Smell lifts spirits. Even simple meals feel sustaining. There is discussion among historians about how monotonous winter diets were. Some argue that variety was limited and nutrition poor. Others point out the use of fermented foods, dairy, and preserved plants that added complexity. The truth likely varied by region and year. You think about salt, valuable and carefully rationed. It preserves food and replaces minerals lost through sweat even in cold. Salt appears in trade records and archaeological traces, emphasizing its importance. Children learn to eat what is available. Preferences matter little. Hunger teaches flexibility. Complaints fade quickly. You notice how eating schedules align with light and fire. Meals cluster around times when the hearth is strongest. Night eating is rare. Fuel is saved. Bodies adapt. There is a subtle social function to winter meals. Eating together reinforces bonds. Stories accompany food. Silence feels heavier without chewing and conversation. You imagine someone scraping the last bits from a bowl, then rinsing it quickly with warm water. Nothing is wasted. Cleanliness matters, but efficiency rules. Food storage also affects smell and air quality. Strong odors linger. Smoke balances them. The longhouse scent becomes layered and familiar. There is evidence that some foods were reserved for special moments even in winter. A small portion of dried fruit, a bit of honey. These treats punctuate monotony, offering psychological relief. You consider the emotional weight of food scarcity. Anxiety rises when stores thin. Relief spreads when rations hold. The Longhouse absorbs these emotions quietly. As winter progresses, portions may shrink. People accept this. Bodies slow. Work reduces. Survival remains possible. You imagine the final days of winter. Stores low but sufficient. Fire steady. Hope builds quietly. Food does more than feed bodies. It structures time. It anchors social life. It provides comfort when light and warmth falter. As you sit near the hearth, bowl empty, you realize that winter eating is an extension of architecture. Storage, smoke, heat, and sharing all intertwine. Soon, attention will shift to the work that fills these long days. Even in deep winter, hands remain busy. Idleness invites cold. After food is eaten and bowls are set aside, the Longhouse does not fall silent. Winter does not pause work. It changes it. Outside, labor fades. But inside, hands remain busy. Movement keeps blood flowing. Purpose keeps mind steady. You look around and see tools within easy reach. Knives hang from pegs. Spindles rest near sleeping platforms. Wood scraps lie stacked neatly against a wall, saved for moments when firelight and patience align. The Longhouse becomes a workshop shaped by cold. Tasks shrink in scale but not importance. Nets are repaired strand by strand. Wool is carded, spun, and wound carefully. Leather is softened and stitched. These activities demand focus without requiring space or daylight. Firelight is enough. Fingers learn to feel rather than see. There is archaeological support for this indoor productivity. Wear marks on tools, concentrations of small artifacts, and patterns in floor deposits all suggest sustained winter work rather than idle waiting. The Longhouse was not simply shelter, it was a center of production. You imagine sitting cross-legged near the fire, hands moving automatically as thread twists into yarn. The rhythm is calming. It fills time gently. Conversation flows around the work. Stories emerge. Jokes pass quietly. Silence is comfortable too. Children participate early. They learn by watching, then by doing. Simple tasks first. Holding fibers, sorting materials. Gradually, responsibility grows. Winter education happens without formal structure. Skills transfer naturally. There is debate among researchers about whether winter work output matched other seasons. Some argue productivity slowed significantly. Others suggest that winter specialization increased efficiency in certain crafts. Evidence varies by settlement. What feels clear is that winter work mattered. You notice how space is managed. Tools return to their places. Clutter is minimized. A crowded house requires order to function. Objects left in the wrong place become hazards in low light. The smell of materials mixes with smoke. Wool, leather, wood. Each scent signals activity. A working house smells different from an idle one. There is a subtle emotional benefit to this steady labor. It gives days shape. It prevents restlessness. When weather traps people indoors for weeks, purpose becomes as vital as warmth. You imagine someone carving quietly, shaping a handle or small object. Wood shavings fall softly. The sound is gentle. Firelight reflects off fresh cuts. The piece grows slowly. Some oral traditions emphasize winter as a time for crafting items used later in trade or travel. Whether exaggerated or not, this aligns with archaeological finds of unfinished goods stored indoors. Winter becomes preparation for movement when thaw arrives. You think about gender roles within this space. While tasks may differ, work overlaps. Everyone contributes. Boundaries blur when survival demands cooperation. There is also repair work. Tools break. Clothing tears. Winter is the time to mend rather than replace. This extends resource life. It also reinforces knowledge of how objects function. You notice how the fire influences work placement. Tasks needing warmth move closer. Tasks needing space drift outward. People shift positions throughout the day, following comfort rather than strict assignment. The longhouse hums quietly. Not loud, but alive. This background activity creates a sense of continuity. Days pass without stagnation. You imagine a particularly harsh stretch of weather. Snow blocks the doorway for days. Outside world shrinks. Inside, work intensifies. The longhouse becomes the entire universe. There is evidence that winter gatherings also served social functions. Decision-making, conflict resolution, planning. With fewer distractions, attention turns inward. Discussions deepen. You sense how architecture supports this. Open space allows group interaction. Firelight centers attention. Acoustics soften voices. Even disagreements feel contained. You think again about children listening from sleeping platforms, absorbing conversations, learning values, learning history. Winter storytelling intertwines with work. There is disagreement among historians about how strictly seasonal tasks were divided. Some argue for rigid cycles. Others suggest flexibility based on need. The longhouse seems to support adaptation rather than rigidity. As hours pass, fire dims and brightens. Hands tire. Then resume. Work slows toward evening. You feel the quiet satisfaction of effort. Winter work does not produce immediate reward, but it builds future security. That knowledge steadies the mind. As darkness returns fully, tasks wind down, tools are set aside, bodies stretch, fire is adjusted for night. You realize that work inside the longhouse is as much about mental survival as physical. It fills space that cold would otherwise claim. Soon, attention will shift again. This time toward the social patterns that govern shared living. When people remain close for months, rules and rituals matter deeply. As winter presses on and the longhouse fills with the same faces day after day, social patterns quietly take on new importance. Shared space magnifies everything. Kindness feels warmer. Tension feels sharper. The architecture that keeps bodies alive must also keep relationships intact. You begin to sense invisible boundaries inside the longhouse. No walls mark them. Yet everyone knows where they are. Certain places near the hearth belong to elders. Others are favored by those who work tools or manage food. Sleeping platforms reflect status, age, and responsibility more than personal choice. This arrangement is not rigid, but it is understood. Order reduces friction. When space is limited, predictability becomes a form of peace. You notice how movement shifts around these zones. People step carefully near respected spaces. Voices lower. Children learn quickly where they may sit and where they should not. Correction is gentle but consistent. There is evidence from saga literature and settlement studies that longhouses functioned as both homes and political spaces. Decisions affecting the household or wider community often occurred here, especially in winter when travel was limited. The longhouse became a place of negotiation, as much as shelter. You imagine discussions unfolding slowly near the fire, not rushed. Winter gives time. Disputes are addressed before they fester. Agreements are reinforced through repetition and shared meals. There is a subtle role played by routine. Daily patterns create stability. People rise, work, eat, rest in familiar cycles. This reduces uncertainty. In a season dominated by darkness and cold, certainty soothes. You think about conflict. It is unavoidable. Irritation grows when privacy is scarce. Someone speaks too sharply. Someone occupies a favored spot too long. These moments are handled through custom rather than force. Some traditions describe the use of humor to diffuse tension. Quiet jokes, familiar teasing, laughter releases pressure. The longhouse supports this by keeping people close enough to read tone and intent. There is discussion among historians about how hierarchy functioned within these shared spaces. Some argue that authority was clearly enforced. Others suggest a more fluid arrangement shaped by competence and contribution. What emerges is a picture of balance. Leadership exists, but cooperation sustains survival. You notice how generosity becomes visible, offering a warmer place, sharing extra food, taking a night watch. These acts build trust. Trust reduces stress. Stress weakens bodies. Children observe all of this. Winter is their classroom. They learn how adults resolve tension. They absorb values without formal instruction. Shared living teaches empathy through necessity. There is also ritual. Simple gestures repeated nightly. A particular phrase before sleep. A shared moment of silence when the fire is banked. These small acts mark time and provide comfort. You imagine a night when a storm rages outside. Wind howls. Snow slams. Inside, people draw closer. Fear is shared, making it smaller. Someone speaks quietly. Another nods. The house holds not just bodies, but courage. There is evidence that winter gatherings strengthened social bonds that lasted into warmer seasons. Alliances formed during hardship carry weight. Trust built in confinement proves durable. You sense how architecture supports this. The open interior prevents isolation. Everyone witnesses everyone else's effort. Laziness is visible. So is generosity. Accountability emerges naturally. There is debate about whether such closeness led to greater harmony or increased conflict. The answer likely varies. What seems clear is that survival required learning how to live together, despite differences. You notice how elders are treated during winter. They are valued repositories of knowledge. Their stories fill dark hours. Their experience guides decisions. Proximity ensures their wisdom remains accessible. You imagine sitting quietly, listening to a story repeated many times before. Each telling shifts slightly. Details change. Lessons remain. This repetition builds shared memory. There is also space for solitude within the crowd. People turn inward without leaving, staring into fire, working quietly, resting eyes. The longhouse allows presence without interaction. You feel the emotional rhythm slow. Days blend. Weeks pass. Tension rises and falls but does not break the structure. As winter nears its deepest point, rituals may intensify. Feasts, when possible, marking the return of light. These moments remind everyone that winter is not endless. You realize that social structure is as carefully layered as walls and roofs. It insulates the community from psychological cold. Soon, attention will turn outward again. Not physically, but spiritually. Beliefs, stories, and unseen forces take on weight during long nights. As winter deepens and nights stretch even longer, attention drifts beyond the physical walls of the longhouse and into the unseen. When cold limits movement and darkness narrows vision, belief fills the space left behind. Stories, rituals, and quiet customs take on greater importance, shaping how people understand their shelter and their survival within it. You sit near the fire and feel how conversation changes at night. Voices lower, words slow. Stories emerge that are not meant to instruct directly, but to steady the mind. Tales of ancestors, accounts of harsh winters endured before. These narratives remind everyone that survival has a history. You are not the first to sit here listening to wind press against turf walls. The longhouse itself feels present in these moments. Beams creak softly. Smoke drifts. Firelight flickers against wood darkened by years of living. It is easy to imagine that the house listens, that it remembers. There is evidence in sagas and folklore that homes were believed to possess protective qualities beyond their materials. Certain posts were treated with care. Thresholds were respected. Crossing into the house was more than entering shelter. It was entering safety shaped by tradition. You notice how routines take on ritual weight, the way fire is banked before sleep, the order in which people settle onto platforms. These actions are repeated nightly, becoming comforting signals that the day has ended safely. Some families placed small objects near hearths or doorways, carved figures, stones, tokens tied to luck or protection. Whether symbolic or psychological, these items offered reassurance when storms howled and the outside world felt hostile. You imagine listening to older voices recounting winters when roofs collapsed or food ran thin. These stories are not told to frighten, they are told to prepare. Knowledge passes quietly, embedded in narrative rather than instruction. There is discussion among historians about how deeply belief influenced architecture. Some suggest that symbolic placement of posts or doors reflected spiritual considerations. Others argue that practicality dominated. Standing here, listening, it feels clear that belief and function were not separate, meaning layered onto necessity. You think about the hearth again. Fire was more than warmth. It was continuity. A flame carried from day to day symbolized life persisting. Letting it die unintentionally felt dangerous in ways that went beyond cold. Children learn these associations early. They sense when fire matters, when silence is appropriate, when stories serve as comfort rather than entertainment. The Longhouse encourages this shared belief space. Open interiors allow everyone to hear, to feel included. No one is isolated with fear. Collective listening reduces anxiety. You imagine nights when storms seem endless. Wind rattles turf. Snow presses hard. Inside, someone begins a familiar story. The rhythm calms breathing. Attention shifts inward. Fear loosens its grip. There is evidence that winter gatherings reinforced cultural identity. Shared myths and values repeated during confinement strengthened group cohesion. This mattered deeply in a world where cooperation ensured survival. You notice how belief also shapes behavior. Respect for the house encourages maintenance. Careful treatment of posts and roof reflects gratitude as much as caution. A respected shelter is better cared for. There is debate about whether Vikings believed spirits inhabited their homes or simply respected them as life-sustaining structures. The line between belief and metaphor blurs. What matters is behavior. Care follows respect. You feel the house holding steady around you. Not just physically, but emotionally. The Longhouse becomes a refuge for thoughts as much as bodies. As night continues, stories fade. Fire dims. Silence returns gently. Sleep follows more easily when minds are settled. These beliefs do not replace architecture. They support it. Walls and roofs keep out cold. Stories keep out despair. Soon, attention will return to practical concerns again. Even belief must bend to weather. Storms demand response. Maintenance never fully stops. But for now, as firelight softens and eyes grow heavy, the Longhouse feels complete. Wood, earth, fire, people, and story all working together. Winter does not remain polite. There comes a point when storms stop feeling occasional and begin to feel relentless. This is when the Longhouse is tested most honestly. Not by cold alone, but by endurance. You feel it in the way the wind presses longer, harder, as if leaning its full weight against the walls to see what will give. You wait to sound first, not noise, but pressure, a deep, constant push. Snow is falling thickly now, driven sideways. Outside, the landscape is erased. Inside, the house responds with creaks and low groans that no longer alarm you. These sounds are familiar. They mean the structure is flexing, not failing. You sit up slowly, listening. Snow slides from the roof in heavy sheets. The sound lands dull and reassuring. This is what the steep roof was made for. Weight does not linger where it can cause harm. Someone is already awake, moving quietly toward the hearth. Embers are coaxed back to life. Light grows. Warmth follows. The house responds almost immediately, as if relieved. Storm days change routine. No one plans to go outside unless absolutely necessary. Doors remain closed. Openings are checked and adjusted. Everyone becomes alert without panic. You imagine the walls under pressure. Wind scours the outer turf. But the mass holds. Earth does not rush heat away. It absorbs force instead. Inside, The temperature drops slightly but remains stable. This difference matters. A few degrees decide comfort or misery. There is archaeological evidence that many longhouses were repaired repeatedly over their lifetimes, especially after severe winters. This suggests that storms regularly tested structures but rarely destroyed them outright. Damage was expected. Collapse was not. You feel the value of redundancy now. Thick walls, multiple roof layers, closely spaced posts. Each feature compensates for another's weakness. Failure in one area does not mean total loss. Animals sense the storm too. They cluster tighter. Their warmth increases. Their presence feels grounding. People move calmly among them, checking partitions, adjusting straw. Children stay close to adults. Stories pause. Work halts. Attention shifts outward, though no one leaves. There is a subtle shift in conversation during storms. Words become practical. Questions focus on roof sound, wind direction, snow depth. Experience speaks. Fear stays controlled. You imagine someone stepping briefly outside despite the storm. They wrap tightly. They move fast. The door opens just enough. Cold crashes inward like water. Snow swirls across the floor. Then the door closes. Inside, warmth recovers slowly, steadily. This moment reinforces trust in the structure. The house absorbs the shock and returns to balance. There is discussion among historians about how often longhouses failed catastrophically. Evidence suggests collapse happened, but less frequently than expected. The combination of slope, weight, and flexibility created resilience rather than rigidity. You notice how fatigue feels different during storms. Bodies tense. Listening becomes work. Even rest carries vigilance. But the longhouse reduces this strain. Walls mute sound. Roof sheds weight. The storm feels contained. Night falls early. Darkness thickens. Firelight becomes the only reference. Outside, the world disappears entirely. Inside, space remains defined and known. Someone begins a quiet task. Spinning. Mending. Movement calms nerves. Productivity resumes in small ways. Storms cannot be allowed to freeze time completely. You lie back down. Listening. Wind rises and falls. The house responds predictably. Each groan has meaning. You learn to distinguish harmless flexing from warning sounds. There is an emotional trust that builds here. The longhouse proves itself repeatedly. Each storm survived reinforces confidence. Confidence reduces fear. Fear drains energy. You imagine the worst hours of the night. When storms peak, snow piles against walls. Roof bears weight. Inside, fire is fed carefully. Smoke balance is maintained. Air remains breathable. There is no heroism here, just routine competence. This is how survival actually looks. By morning, storm intensity fades. Wind quiets. Snow settles. Light returns faintly. The house stands unchanged, except for deeper drifts leaning against its sides. People move again with purpose. Repairs begin if needed. Turf pressed back. Roof checked. Damage addressed early. You realize that winter survival is not about dramatic resistance. It is about designing life so that storms become manageable rather than overwhelming. As calm returns, the longhouse releases tension slowly. Breathing deepens. Work resumes more fully. Stories return. This cycle repeats many times each winter. Storm. Hold. Recover. The house and its people learn together. Soon, attention will turn to the wear these months place on the structure itself. Even the strongest shelter ages. Maintenance becomes the next quiet battle against winter. When the storm passes and calm returns, you begin to notice the subtle toll winter takes on the longhouse itself. Survival is not static. Even the strongest shelter slowly changes under constant pressure. Cold tightens wood. Thaw loosens it again. Snow scours turf. Smoke darkens beams. The house ages quietly. and caring for it becomes a daily responsibility rather than a single task. You walk the interior slowly, eyes adjusting to familiar shapes. You look for signs. A faint draft where none existed before. A darker patch on the wall where moisture has settled. A beam that creaks a little louder than it did last season. These details matter. Ignoring them invites bigger problems when winter is least forgiving. Maintenance does not wait for spring. It happens whenever conditions allow. Someone presses loose turf back into place. Another adds fresh clay to a seam where light shows through. These repairs are small, almost invisible, but they preserve warmth and stability. There is strong evidence from excavated sites that longhouses underwent constant minor repair. Layers of turf show replacement cycles. Posts reveal reinforcement. Floors are resurfaced repeatedly. This suggests that Viking homes were not built once and abandoned to fate. They were tended like living things. You imagine the rhythm of these tasks. Not urgent. Not rushed. Someone notices an issue. It is addressed that same day or the next. This prevents accumulation. Winter rewards attention. You feel how cold exaggerates weakness. A tiny gap becomes a stream of air. A damp patch spreads quickly. Maintenance is not optional. It is survival practice. Tools for repair remain close at hand. Clay mixtures kept warm enough to remain workable. Spare turf stacked near the house. Wood wedges ready to tighten joints. Preparation extends beyond initial construction. There is a quieter lesson here. Building the longhouse was only the beginning. Keeping it functional required continuous effort. Shelter was not a finished object. It was a relationship. You imagine a particularly cold morning when frost creeps along the interior wall. Someone notices and traces it back to a thinning turf layer. Repairs begin immediately. Fingers numb. Work slow. But when finished, warmth returns. Some researchers suggest that this constant maintenance created deep familiarity with the house. People knew every sound, every slope, every weakness. This knowledge reduced anxiety. Nothing felt unpredictable. You think about children growing up watching these repairs, learning where to look. What mattered? They absorb this awareness naturally, becoming future caretakers of similar shelters. Maintenance also extends to the roof. Snow weight shifts turf. Wind lifts edges. Whenever weather allows, someone climbs carefully, pressing sod back into place, adding weight where needed. This work is dangerous but necessary. There is debate about how often roofs were fully rebuilt. Evidence suggests partial replacement was more common than complete reconstruction. This allowed houses to last generations, evolving rather than restarting. You feel appreciation for the materials again. Wood allows adjustment. Turf can be replaced easily. Clay responds to moisture. Each material supports repair rather than resisting it. Inside, soot continues to build. This is not cleaned aggressively. It protects wood. It seals gaps. Cleanliness yields to function. You notice how maintenance tasks also structure time. They give purpose during long weeks of confinement. Fixing the house feels productive and reassuring. It reinforces control in a season dominated by uncontrollable forces. There is also shared responsibility. Everyone contributes. Even small tasks matter. Holding a ladder, passing tools, watching for falling snow. Cooperation reinforces bonds. You imagine an evening after repairs are complete. The house feels tighter, quieter, warmer. Satisfaction spreads silently. No one celebrates, but everyone feels it. There is a subtle emotional comfort in caring for shelter. It responds. It improves. Effort yields immediate benefit. This counters the helplessness winter can impose. Some oral traditions describe houses being spoken to, thanked, or acknowledged after repairs. Whether literal or symbolic, this suggests recognition of shelter as partner rather than object. You feel the house settle again as night approaches. Fire glows. Walls hold. Roof rests under snow. Winter continues. But confidence grows. Each repair survived strengthens trust. As the season progresses, attention begins to shift subtly, not outward yet, but forward. People start noticing changes. Daylight lingers a little longer. Snow softens at edges. These signs are faint but meaningful. The Longhouse has done its work. It has carried life through the worst weeks. Now, slowly, it prepares to release its grip as winter loosens. Soon, attention will turn to the subtle transition from confinement to movement. From inward focus to outward possibility. The house will remain central, but its role will change. For now, as repairs settle and fire steadies, you rest again, confident that the shelter around you remains ready for whatever winter still holds. As winter continues to stretch, you begin to notice how subtle regional differences shape Longhouse life. Not every house is identical. Fjords, plains, and forests each impose their own rules. Builders adapt instinctively, responding to environment in ways that outsiders might overlook. You imagine traveling from one settlement to another. Roofs shift in angle. Turf thickness varies. Post spacing changes. Walls lean differently. Each choice reflects local conditions. Wind direction, snow load, and available timber all influence design. Even soil type can dictate how posts are anchored or which side receives more protection from storms. There is strong archaeological evidence that these variations were practical. Coastal houses often have shallower turf layers because salty winds prevent heavy accumulation. Inland houses carry heavier sod and steeper roofs to shed snow more efficiently. Builders read their environment carefully, applying lessons learned over generations. You notice how these regional choices extend to interior life. Sleeping platforms may be higher in colder regions to catch rising warmth. Animals may be housed closer in less temperate areas. Storage patterns shift depending on which foods are most reliable locally. The Longhouse is a living map of adaptation. Some scholars point out that cultural factors also influence construction. Local traditions shape roof decorations, hearth placement, and even the sequence of daily tasks. Function and identity intertwine. The house is practical and expressive at once. You imagine a day when a stranger visits from another region. They immediately notice differences. Subtle smells, distinct layout, slightly varied floor texture. These differences communicate information silently. They tell who has learned what, and which strategies have been tested against local winter challenges. There is a less discussed advantage to regional adaptation. It encourages observation and experimentation. Even small deviations from standard practices reveal weaknesses or opportunities. The Longhouse evolves slowly as people respond to real experience. You picture children growing up absorbing these subtle variations. They notice that even slight differences affect comfort or efficiency. They learn the local language of walls, roofs, and fire before they learn formal lessons. These skills are both practical and cultural. Animals also reflect these regional strategies. Certain livestock are favored where terrain and vegetation differ. Animals are positioned for maximum warmth and minimal disruption to human routines. Their behavior communicates subtle environmental cues, which the inhabitants read carefully. You notice how ventilation is tuned differently across regions. Coastal winds encourage larger gaps near doorways, while inland houses favor smaller, more controlled openings to prevent cold drafts. Smoke management varies as well, depending on roof design and height. These choices influence air quality, fire safety, and the ability to maintain warmth efficiently. There is discussion among historians about whether regional differences are purely environmental or also symbolic. Some evidence suggests that longhouses conveyed status or identity, ornamentation, roofline style, and layout could communicate lineage or reputation. Even functional details carried subtle social meaning. You imagine a community comparing practices across settlements, observing, adopting, modifying. Knowledge travels slowly, adjusted by experience. Regional adaptation becomes a form of communication and learning. You also sense how winter pressures amplify the consequences of these differences. A design that works well near a fjord may fail inland. Builders must remain attentive, observing every frost, snowdrift, and wind gust. Adaptation is not optional, it is survival. You picture a particularly harsh storm in one region. Roofs designed for lighter snow fail partially. Repairs are made. Lessons recorded silently in practice. In another settlement, designs hold perfectly, validating local methods. Knowledge accumulates through consequence. Children again observe. They see repairs, adjustments, and improvisation. Skills transmit organically. Winter becomes a teacher, emphasizing observation, problem-solving, and anticipation. You notice that small differences also affect social dynamics. Sleeping arrangements, task allocation, and animal placement shift to match environment. Cooperation and attention to detail are reinforced daily. There is a subtle beauty in this. The longhouse, though outwardly similar across regions, is uniquely tuned to its place. Each one demonstrates a quiet balance between necessity and ingenuity. You imagine returning to your own longhouse after visiting several settlements. Familiar yet distinct. Lessons gathered from afar inform your work. Small modifications improve efficiency. Comfort increases without dramatic changes. As the sun dips low, returning dim light to interior spaces, you feel the rhythm of winter life synchronized across communities. Differences are acknowledged, absorbed, and adapted to. Resilience becomes a shared language. Soon, attention will move inward again, toward the spiritual and cultural elements intertwined with survival. Stories, rituals, and beliefs respond to both environment and human experience, shaping life inside these walls. As the long months of winter stretch onward, the focus naturally turns from practical survival to the subtler currents of belief that flow through life inside the longhouse. When daylight is scarce, snow presses against walls, and the wind hums through the turf. Stories and rituals acquire weight. They guide behavior, sustain hope, and shape the atmosphere in ways as real as timber or fire. You sit near the hearth and notice how stories begin almost spontaneously. Elders recount ancestors who endured harsh winters, navigated storms, or repaired collapsed roofs. These tales are not recited for entertainment alone. They transmit knowledge. Technique, caution, and wisdom are woven into narrative. Children absorb lessons before they are ever conscious of learning. There is evidence from both archaeology and oral history that objects placed within the longhouse held symbolic meaning. Small carved figures, stones, or simple tokens often rested on beams, near hearths, or in storage spaces, whether intended as spiritual protection, markers of luck, or reminders of past successes. These items shaped behavior. Care of the house was inseparable from respect for unseen forces. You imagine the quiet rhythm of winter nights, punctuated by ritualized routines. Feeding the fire becomes an almost ceremonial act. Checking turf layers on the roof or walls is undertaken with attentiveness that borders on reverence. Even sweeping the floor, replacing straw, or tending animals takes on a ritual cadence when repetition spans weeks and months. Some accounts suggest that minor ceremonies accompany major seasonal transitions. The return of light after the winter solstice might be marked with small feasts or gatherings by the hearth. Fire, food, and warmth intertwine with meaning. Survival is not solely physical, it is cultural and psychological as well. You notice how belief intertwines with practical knowledge. For example, certain posts or corners of the longhouse were treated carefully, sometimes painted or carved, sometimes left untouched. These spaces were associated with protection or ancestral presence. At the same time, the posts themselves supported roofs and walls, proving that symbolic and practical value often converged. There is discussion among modern historians about the extent to which these practices influenced behavior. Some argue that belief in spirits or protective forces guided care for the house and vigilance in repairs. Others suggest that the stories reinforced community cohesion and attention to detail. without necessarily involving literal belief. Either way, rituals shaped daily patterns. You feel the atmosphere of the longhouse shifting during storytelling. Even when the tales are repeated, listeners lean closer, voices soften, and attention focuses inward. The smoke, warmth, and faint light combine to create a shared mental space, a containment against the vast darkness outside. Children absorb this culture naturally. They witness elders performing tasks with deliberate care. They hear cautionary tales about neglecting repairs or underestimating storms. Lessons are internalized quietly, becoming part of their instincts rather than formal education. You observe how the longhouse itself reinforces these rituals. Open spaces allow everyone to see and hear. Hearths provide a natural center for gathering. Elevated platforms offer visual cues and organize movement. Even the smell of smoke and damp earth communicates life and continuity. There is a subtle link between belief and morale. In harsh conditions, the knowledge that the house and its traditions have endured many winters provides reassurance. Fear diminishes when routines, rituals, and stories align to suggest competence and experience. Anxiety is moderated by familiarity and predictability. You imagine a storm pressing heavily against the turf. Snow slides off the roof. A low rumble echoing across the settlement. Inside, stories continue. Elders speak softly. Children listen. Adults adjust fuel and insulation. The combination of fire, architecture, and ritual creates a protective environment, both physically and psychologically. Some traditions emphasize giving thanks for the house itself, the materials it is built from, and the labor invested in maintaining it. Whether literal or symbolic, these acknowledgements reinforce attention and care. People treat the structure with respect, knowing that survival depends on vigilance. You notice that rituals also provide markers of time. In a season when days blur into nights and weeks seem unmeasured, repeated actions banking the fire, checking walls, distributing rations structure life. Patterns become predictable, offering comfort and stability in a harsh environment. There is debate about how literally Vikings believed in spiritual protection versus how much it was a social convention. Some evidence points to genuine belief in spirits associated with thresholds, posts, and hearths. Other interpretations suggest that these practices reinforced social cohesion and obedience to practical routines. Either interpretation highlights the integration of belief into daily life. You watch the effect on children and newcomers. Learning occurs not in lectures, but through observation, participation, and immersion. They internalize caution, respect, and routine through practice and ritual. This prepares them for winters they will face as adults. You imagine the longhouse at its quietest moment, embers glowing faintly. Outside, snow presses silently. Inside, rituals continue almost imperceptibly. People adjust coverings, stir embers, or check animals. Stories whisper through memory and speech. Life continues, shaped by both necessity and belief. As night deepens, these patterns consolidate. The longhouse becomes a repository of knowledge, culture, and experience. Every wall, post, and beam holds accumulated wisdom. Every story, ritual, and action reinforces the balance between survival and continuity. Soon, attention will return to danger. Fire, light, and belief provide stability. But risk remains. Flame threatens timber. Snow threatens roof and walls. Animals move unpredictably. Human error continues to challenge endurance. Winter is never entirely predictable, even with fire, warmth, and ritual stabilizing life in the longhouse. Danger never disappears. Risk exists in every element of the structure and every action taken within it. Flame is essential, yet it threatens the very materials that sustain it. Timber and turf can ignite if care lapses. Sparks from cooking or repairing tools must be monitored constantly. In winter, Mistakes carry higher stakes than they do in milder seasons. You imagine someone tending the fire while another adjusts the turf roof above. Embers flick upward faintly. Attention is split between multiple tasks, each critical to survival. One moment of distraction could allow a spark to land where dry material waits. Experience teaches vigilance. Awareness becomes habitual. There is strong evidence from excavations that longhouses were designed with fire safety in mind. Hearths were surrounded by stones and packed earth to reduce accidental ignition. Openings and ventilation were carefully measured. Roofs sloped to shed snow, but also to minimize contact with smoke or sparks. Design and caution worked together. You notice how these precautions influence behavior. People move carefully around the house. Tools are laid down deliberately. Conversations pause when attention is required. Even children, who might otherwise be restless, internalize the rules. Habit becomes protection. Smoke continues to play a dual role. It keeps warmth steady and preserves timber. Yet it is also a subtle warning system. A sudden change in smoke pattern can indicate that fire is too strong. That fuel is damp, or that wind has shifted. Reading these signals is part of life. Ignoring them has consequences. There is discussion among modern scholars about the prevalence of fires in longhouses. Some argue that evidence of destruction is minimal, suggesting effective practices. Others note that many structures leave little trace if they burn, biasing the record. Either way, vigilance appears central to survival. You imagine the moment when small sparks appear unexpectedly. Hands move quickly, gathering embers. Water or ash is applied. Damage is prevented. The longhouse responds to care and attention. Neglect ensures loss. Animals also influence risk management. Livestock close to fire provide warmth. Yet they may panic. Sudden movement can knock tools or fuel, creating hazards. People learn to anticipate animal behavior, positioning them for safety while still gaining thermal benefit. You feel the subtle impact of living with constant risk. It sharpens awareness. Repetition reduces mistakes. Anxiety is tempered by knowledge and routine. Life becomes a balance between respect for danger and practical action. Children observe closely. They learn that fire is both life-giving and destructive. They see adults adjusting routines, prioritizing vigilance over comfort. These lessons form instinctive knowledge that becomes critical when they manage the house themselves. Some traditions hint at ritualistic acknowledgement of fire risk. Small gestures, such as offering thanks before tending the hearth or quiet recitations to mark completion of tasks, reinforce mindfulness. Even if symbolic, these practices shape attention and reduce accidents. You notice how the design of the longhouse mitigates cumulative risk. Thick walls prevent drafts that could fan flames. Turf roofs absorb stray sparks. Posts support structures that resist collapse, even if minor fires occur. Layers of precaution exist everywhere. There is also preparation for emergencies. Water containers are kept near key areas. Ash is accessible to smother embers. People know exit paths. Even in darkness, these measures are routine, internalized, and practiced silently. Winter is long. Repetition ensures readiness. You imagine a cold night when one mistake occurs. A small ember lands on straw. Response is immediate. Smoke rises differently. The person nearby acts instinctively, preventing disaster. Learning through observation and practice ensures mistakes do not escalate. This vigilance extends to food and storage. Sparks near grain or dried fish could ruin sustenance for weeks. Awareness of location, wind, and material properties becomes part of daily life. Every step is deliberate. You notice that risk management reinforces social cohesion. Individuals must coordinate. Someone monitors fire while another adjusts animals or prepares food. Shared responsibility strengthens bonds. Ignoring duty endangers everyone. Even with precaution, accidents happen. When they do, learning spreads quickly. The house itself records lessons through marks, repairs, and adjusted routines. Over time, Experience reduces the likelihood of recurrence. You sense the psychological effect of living with controlled danger. Anxiety is tempered by capability. Confidence grows through competence. The Longhouse is not simply a shelter, it is a training ground in awareness, foresight, and cooperation. As night deepens, you feel the rhythm of vigilance settle into habit. Movements become smooth. Fire is tended automatically. Animals are checked periodically. Walls, roof, and hearth are respected constantly. Soon, your attention will turn outward again. Survival requires not only mastering internal risks, but anticipating what winter may throw against the house from beyond its walls. Storms, cold, and snow all remain active forces. The Longhouse will face them again and again. As the long weeks of winter pass, another subtle force shapes life inside the Longhouse, the rhythm of noise and quiet. Sound is never neutral here. It travels differently across timber, turf, and packed earth. The house itself seems to filter it, softening some echoes, amplifying others. Living in this space requires awareness of both what is spoken and what remains unspoken. You notice the way conversations shift naturally. Voices near the hearth are calm, deliberate. Words spread slowly through the central aisle. Sounds from the animal end remain muted. This natural partitioning allows multiple activities to occur simultaneously without chaos. A quiet order emerges organically. Even footsteps matter. Wooden floors creak under weight. Heavy steps draw attention. People move carefully, not out of fear, but because the house itself demands mindfulness. Silence signals attentiveness, but it can also be a warning. Unusual sounds alert everyone to changes in wind, snow, pressure, or animal behavior. There is evidence that such acoustics were well understood, even if implicitly. Wear patterns in floorboards and placement of sleeping platforms suggest deliberate planning to manage sound. Where children slept, vibrations from movement were minimized. Work zones were placed to reduce disruption. You imagine lying on a sleeping platform while someone sharpens tools nearby. The rhythm is familiar. The noise is part of the night, almost comforting. Breathing is easier when predictability prevails. Disorder in sound, by contrast, creates tension. The Longhouse mediates both extremes. Animals add complexity to this auditory environment. Cattle shift, sheep murmur, goats shuffle. Their sounds become part of the Longhouse language. Movement is read instinctively, providing information about comfort, health, or the weather outside. Children learn to interpret these signals before they can fully understand abstract concepts. Some historians suggest that awareness of sound may have influenced internal architecture. Platforms, walls, and partitions were positioned not only for warmth or light, but to control acoustics. A soft creak, a muffled shout, or the subtle rustle of fur all communicate survival-critical information. You notice how nighttime sounds differ from daytime activity. In darkness, every creak, cough, and whisper carries weight. People adjust their behavior instinctively. Light and heat create safety, but sound reminds occupants to remain alert without panic. This balance shapes both movement and interaction. There is a subtle educational component as well. Children absorb patterns of sound, learning timing, attention, and consequence. They understand when to speak, when to move, and when to remain still. Winter life teaches this through lived experience rather than formal instruction. You observe how this rhythm affects work. Tasks are timed around periods of quiet and activity. Spinning or sewing occurs in rhythm with other activities, minimizing interference. Conversations flow gently around these movements, coordinated by awareness and habit. Even fire contributes to the acoustic environment. Crackling and popping are indicators of fuel and airflow. Someone accustomed to the house can detect small deviations, a change in sound signals that embers are too dry, wood is misaligned, or wind has shifted unexpectedly. Listening becomes a survival tool. You imagine a storm outside, Wind rattles roof timbers. Snow strikes walls. Inside, humans and animals adapt to the noise. Distinguishing between natural creaking and potential danger becomes essential. Vigilance is subtle, learned, and continuous. There is discussion among scholars about the importance of communal listening in maintaining cohesion. Shared auditory experience aligns attention and reinforces social bonds. People are aware not only of their own presence, but of the ongoing activity of others. Coordination occurs naturally, reducing accidents and misunderstandings. You notice that during particularly long nights, sound also provides comfort. The familiar murmur of conversation, the crackle of fire, and the low breaths of sleeping animals create a reassuring environment. Even in extended darkness, these auditory cues maintain psychological balance. Children learn to navigate this environment. Their senses become finely tuned to minor variations in noise. They recognize when someone is approaching, when embers require tending, when animals are restless. This awareness integrates into skill sets that will support them as adults responsible for the household. You imagine a night when multiple tasks occur simultaneously. Someone spins wool near the fire. Another checks food stores. Children quietly practice simple chores. The rhythm is layered, complex, and harmonious. Noise and silence coexist productively. You begin to appreciate that this acoustic awareness is as critical as fire or insulation. Heat preserves bodies. Food sustains them. Sound preserves attention, coordination, and safety. The longhouse functions as a living organism, with inhabitants attuned to its rhythms. Soon, attention will shift to the seasonal changes themselves. Winter will eventually yield to thaw. The longhouse will release its grip, and movement beyond its walls will resume. But for now, sound governs time, space, and life inside. As winter continues to press outward, you begin to sense the subtle shaping of daily life by the passing of time and the rhythm of the seasons. Even deep within the protective walls of the longhouse, you feel that winter imposes its own clock. Days are short, light is scarce, and movement outside is limited. But inside, life continues according to its own measured tempo. You notice how this seasonal rhythm dictates activity. Tasks that can be performed indoors, such as weaving, mending, and food preparation, dominate the day. Even movement is choreographed by necessity. People shift carefully between hearth, storage, and sleeping areas, conserving energy while ensuring productivity. The house itself seems to impose this rhythm. Guiding steps, gestures, and timing. There is archaeological evidence that activity patterns changed over the course of winter. Floors near hearths show heavier wear during the darkest weeks, suggesting that people concentrated around warmth and light. Platforms and sleeping areas are used more evenly as winter progresses, indicating adaptive strategies for maintaining heat and comfort. You imagine the subtle psychological effects of this routine. Repetition creates stability in an otherwise harsh and unpredictable environment. Time becomes comprehensible through actions rather than clocks. Feeding animals, tending the fire, repairing structures, and preparing meals mark the passage of days. These repeated cycles give life meaning even when the world outside seems frozen and unchanging. Children learn this pattern intuitively. They observe the elders, internalize routines, and participate in communal tasks. Education occurs not in structured lessons, but through practice, observation, and participation. Children grow to understand not only practical survival but also the temporal rhythm that governs winter life. Some traditions suggest that seasonal markers are reinforced through ritual or storytelling. Certain days are set aside for reflection, minor celebrations, or communal gatherings. These moments punctuate the monotony and offer psychological relief. They also reinforce social bonds, reminding everyone that life extends beyond the immediate challenges of survival. You notice how these rhythms influence energy management. People pace themselves carefully, balancing work, rest, and sleep. Overexertion can be dangerous in freezing temperatures. So movement is deliberate. Tasks requiring more strength are undertaken when the fire is hottest, while more delicate or quiet tasks occur during low activity periods. Winter teaches efficiency through necessity. There is a subtle hierarchy to the management of seasonal routines. Elders and experienced members guide the allocation of tasks, ensuring that the workload is distributed appropriately. Respect and authority are reinforced through competence rather than imposed formality. Observation and experience dominate over rigid rules. You imagine how knowledge of these seasonal patterns integrates with physical maintenance. Roofs, walls, and floors are inspected and repaired according to cycles. Ventilation adjustments are made as temperatures fluctuate. Food stores are rotated. The house and its occupants are synchronized with environmental pressures. Even minor details matter. Snow drifts that build outside during a storm affect door placement and entrance clearance. Daylight levels influence when work begins or ends. Wind direction shapes airflow inside. Residents respond intuitively, making subtle adjustments that preserve warmth, comfort, and safety. You notice how these cycles influence social interaction. Conversations are scheduled around firelight and activity. Quiet periods allow focus on work or reflection. Communal periods encourage storytelling, discussion, or entertainment. This structuring of time reduces conflict and enhances cooperation. There is debate among scholars about how strictly these rhythms were followed. Some argue that seasonal adaptation was highly flexible, responding to immediate needs. Others suggest that long-established patterns provided stability, helping people manage both physical and psychological challenges. Evidence from multiple settlements indicates that both flexibility and consistency were essential. You observe how food consumption fits into these patterns. Meals are timed to maximize efficiency and warmth. Portions are carefully measured. Heat from the hearth is leveraged for cooking and drying. Resources are conserved strategically to last through the harshest weeks. Children learn early to anticipate these routines. They develop awareness of when to speak, when to move, and when to rest. Winter imposes discipline without explicit instruction. Behavioral patterns emerge naturally from environmental and social pressures. You imagine the quiet satisfaction of evenings when routines proceed smoothly. Fire glows steadily. Smoke escapes predictably. Food is prepared efficiently. And animals are settled securely. The house functions as intended. People move with coordination. Children observe and internalize. Safety, comfort, and continuity are reinforced through repetition. You sense how this seasonal rhythm also shapes anticipation. Even in the depths of winter, awareness of the eventual thaw begins to influence behavior. Preparations for spring are integrated into current activities. Food stores, tool maintenance, and household repairs are planned with future needs in mind. This combination of immediate survival and long-term foresight becomes embedded in the culture of the Longhouse. As night falls once again, activities wind down. Tasks are completed in order. Embers glow faintly. Walls and roof absorb heat steadily. Animals rest. Children and adults alike settle into their platforms. The Longhouse breathes quietly, a stable organism within the dynamic pressures of the environment. Soon, attention will shift toward archaeology and oral memory, the ways in which knowledge of these rhythms is preserved. The house not only shelters bodies but also records history, culture, and practice. Winter leaves its mark, both materially and socially, inside these enduring structures. Even as winter begins to wane, another layer of understanding emerges from the Longhouse. You realize that what survives most clearly through time is not just timber or turf, but memory. Archaeology and oral traditions intersect to reveal the lives, skills, and choices of those who built and inhabited these structures. The Longhouse itself becomes a repository of knowledge, preserving lessons in design, behavior, and adaptation for generations to come. You imagine the traces left behind, post holes filled with soil, faint impressions in packed earth floors, charred timbers from hearths, and displaced turf layers all tell subtle stories. Each layer is evidence of the decisions made under pressure. Where repairs were repeated, the house records trial and success. Where layouts shifted, it signals adaptation to changing needs or environments. These material clues inform modern understanding of life in harsh northern climates. There is evidence suggesting that longhouse construction evolved regionally, shaped by climate, resources, and social structure. Coastal settlements feature shallower turf layers and slightly different post spacing than inland houses. Variations in roof pitch, wall thickness, and interior layout reflect both practical adjustments and local traditions. Observing these differences allows modern researchers to infer strategies for survival and social organization. You notice how oral memory supplements these physical traces. Stories, sagas, and family accounts preserve knowledge about past winters, roof collapses, storm patterns, and successful adaptations. While the accuracy of these narratives varies, they often highlight key decisions and techniques that archaeological evidence alone cannot capture. Repetition of these stories reinforces community identity and survival strategies, blending practical knowledge with cultural continuity. Some scholars debate the relative influence of oral tradition versus material evidence. One interpretation is that stories reinforce what is physically observable, guiding behavior in subtle ways. Another perspective suggests that narratives sometimes exaggerate or mythologize experiences, obscuring practical lessons. Both contribute to a richer understanding of longhouse life, showing how experience and memory coexist. You imagine walking through a longhouse centuries after it was first built. Signs of wear and repair are evident. Floors are smooth where repeated footsteps pressed earth. Beams are darkened by smoke and age. Patches of turf have been replaced. Each mark conveys decision-making, problem-solving, and adaptation to environmental stress. The house becomes a record of survival. The interplay of memory and structure extends to social norms. Placement of sleeping platforms, hearths, and storage reflects hierarchy, cooperation, and learned practice. Elders occupy the most advantageous positions, not by decree alone, but because survival depended on experience. Children and younger members absorb routines and responsibilities through observation, embedding lessons that will carry forward. You notice how technological details persist in both material and story. Techniques for stacking turf, shaping posts, or adjusting roof pitch survive in physical remains and oral instruction. Innovations, failures, and repairs are remembered and transmitted, forming a cumulative body of knowledge across generations. There is a subtle psychological effect to these preserved memories. Knowledge of past winters provides confidence. Stories of prior survival reassure individuals that challenges can be met. This emotional continuity reinforces social cohesion, allowing inhabitants to endure not only environmental pressure but also mental strain. You imagine a storm outside, snow pressing heavily against walls. Inside, occupants act instinctively, guided by lessons encoded in architecture and tradition. Decisions about fire, animal placement, and minor repairs reflect accumulated experience. The house itself seems to remind residents of what works. Every creak and shift carries meaning. Some oral traditions emphasize cautionary tales, illustrating the consequences of neglect or poor judgment. Roofs that failed, walls that let in drafts, or fires that spread are remembered and recounted. These stories function as practical teaching tools, ensuring that mistakes are not repeated unnecessarily. You observe that memory and material evidence together create resilience. Houses survive longer when inhabitants learn from experience. Communities endure harsh winters more effectively when knowledge is preserved and shared. Continuity is reinforced both physically and socially. Children internalize these lessons naturally. They watch, participate, and repeat routines, embedding knowledge before conscious reasoning. Skills in carpentry, fire management, animal care, and daily routines are transmitted seamlessly across generations. The longhouse becomes a classroom without walls or formal instruction. You notice how this preserved knowledge interacts with seasonal rhythms. Activities in early winter are influenced by what was learned in prior years. Adjustments to ventilation, hearth management, and snow clearance reflect memory and practice. Anticipation of challenges allows residents to act proactively rather than reactively. There is also an aesthetic dimension to memory. Minor repairs, patterning of turf, and arrangement of sleeping platforms signal care and attention. These choices carry meaning, reinforcing pride, competence, and community cohesion. The longhouse embodies both function and culture. You imagine stepping back and observing the house as a holistic system. Walls, roof, fire, food, sound, and social interaction all interconnect. Each layer informs the others. Memory overlays physical structure. Knowledge accumulates quietly. Season after season, winter is harsh, but these accumulated lessons make survival possible. Soon, attention will turn to the final release of winter. As snow softens and days lengthen, the longhouse transitions from a fortress against cold to a home preparing for renewed movement. The end of the season will bring new challenges, but also liberation. At last, winter begins to loosen its grip. Snow softens. Daylight lingers longer. The longhouse, which has served as both sanctuary and school, prepares to release its occupants into a world that has changed subtly while they remained inside. The transition is slow, measured, and almost imperceptible. You notice it first in the feel of the floor underfoot, slightly softer as ice and frost recede. Then in the smell of air, sharper and fresher than the recycled scent of smoke and livestock. The house has held its lessons through weeks of darkness, cold, and routine. Now it will teach a final one movement. You imagine opening the door carefully, adjusting to the brightness without shock. Light feels generous after months of muted shadows. Snow sparkles, but the air is colder than you anticipated, reminding you that winter is not yet fully gone. Stepping outside requires patience. Each movement is deliberate. The cold presses against clothing and exposed skin. Yet it no longer feels entirely threatening. Survival has become embodied. You know how to navigate extremes. The longhouse itself seems to exhale. Beams have expanded and contracted with the passing months. Turf layers are moist but firm. Smoke-stained wood has dried in parts. The house has endured, adapting to pressure without collapse. Every repair, adjustment, and minor ritual over the season has paid off. Observing it, you recognize that the building's resilience is inseparable from the knowledge embedded in its walls. It is a record of winter's hardships and human ingenuity. You notice the animals shifting as well. Sheep, goats, and cattle move closer to the openings, sensing the change in temperature and light. Their behavior signals the house's readiness to transition from enclosed survival to more freedom. Humans and animals alike begin to anticipate the gradual release. Livestock will soon spend more time outside, grazing as the snow recedes. This redistribution reduces indoor crowding, improves air quality, and allows inhabitants to reclaim interior space. There is subtle evidence from archaeological records that the last weeks of winter were a time of both preparation and celebration. Households would clean floors, replace worn turf, repair roof edges, and check structural stability one final time before the thaw. Food stores were inventoried and carefully managed to bridge the gap until new provisions became available. Rituals or small communal gatherings marked this transition, signaling both relief and renewed attention to work that awaited outside. These acts blended practical necessity with cultural rhythm, reinforcing the longhouse as a hub of both survival and social cohesion. You imagine the quiet bustle inside. People stretch after long confinement. Children move more freely, exploring corners that had been restricted. Tasks become less urgent, but no less important, repairing tools, maintaining clothing, and preparing provisions for early spring expeditions. The fire continues to burn steadily, though it no longer commands as much attention. Its role shifts from critical survival to comfort. Smoke rises more leisurely, and the smell, once dense and insistent, becomes familiar and calming. Life feels lighter, yet deliberate. Every gesture carries the imprint of months of adaptation and attentive living. Outside, snow continues to melt slowly. Patches of earth and stone emerge, marking paths toward distant resources, streams, and grazing areas. The sun, higher in the sky than it has been for months, casts longer shadows and warms the exposed terrain subtly. You notice how inhabitants adapt naturally to these cues. Movements are slower at first, deliberate, as bodies readjust to outdoor conditions. Cold, which once demanded constant vigilance, now functions as a gentle reminder rather than an immediate threat. Winter has been endured. The longhouse has trained its occupants in awareness, patience, and collective resilience. You consider the social dynamics within the house during this period. Close proximity over months of limited space has strengthened bonds. Communication is smoother. Unspoken signals are understood, and cooperation is instinctive. Trust has been earned through shared labor, vigilance, and care for both structure and animals. As people begin to prepare for more mobility outside, these relationships inform decision-making, prioritization of tasks, and distribution of responsibilities. The longhouse functions as both a protective envelope and a social training ground, where hierarchy, skill, and intuition are continuously reinforced. There is also an emotional transition. Anxiety cultivated during long nights of storms, darkness, and confinement gradually softens. The return of light and the prospect of movement beyond the house allow hope to emerge. Individuals feel a renewed sense of agency. The knowledge of past survival builds confidence. The house, which has kept bodies and spirits safe, now permits release and exploration. Yet this liberation is measured. Experience teaches that abrupt transitions can be hazardous. Snowfields remain treacherous. Cold air can still bite unexpectedly. Skills learned in confinement guide careful movement. Each step outside reflects months of internalized wisdom. Children, in particular, respond with subtle excitement. They test boundaries of indoor space before venturing toward the door. They observe adults managing fire, tools, and animals with precise attention. Lessons absorbed in long hours of repetition inform behavior instinctively. Skills such as adjusting clothing, moving animals safely, and recognizing environmental cues manifest naturally. Learning continues outside, but it is built upon the embodied knowledge gained inside the longhouse. You notice the psychological impact of this seasonal shift. Winter has constrained action, enforced attention, and demanded careful coordination. As restrictions ease, the longhouse provides a secure base from which individuals can assess environmental changes. Confidence is grounded not in luck, but in the cumulative experience of endurance. Knowledge stored in the arrangement of walls, roof, hearth, and animal enclosures becomes actionable wisdom. The house's design, care, and maintenance throughout winter are validated as the season transitions. You imagine the final moments before the first significant excursion outside. Livestock are fed and positioned carefully. Tools and provisions are organized for easy transport. Fire is banked to preserve embers without wasting fuel. Individuals move with purpose, yet with measured caution. Every action reflects months of practice, trial, and observation. The house, though stationary, continues to influence behavior, enforcing routines and reinforcing the lessons winter has taught. The longhouse has fulfilled its role fully. It has sheltered bodies, preserved warmth, and enabled survival in the harshest months. It has functioned as a center for social learning, cultural reinforcement, and skill transmission. It has mediated the tension between humans and environment, providing stability in the face of persistent external pressures. Its walls, roof, and hearth are not merely structures, they are repositories of embodied knowledge, social cohesion, and historical continuity. Now, stepping outside, the world feels familiar, yet transformed. Snow covers familiar terrain but in altered shapes. Paths are softened. Light reveals subtle contours previously obscured. Movement is measured, deliberate, guided by skill, experience, and the quiet lessons of confinement. The longhouse releases its occupants with confidence in the skills and relationships honed over months of winter. Though winter still exerts influence through residual cold and snow, the longhouse has provided a buffer, allowing inhabitants to emerge with preparedness. The final release of winter does not come as sudden liberation, but as a gradual expansion of agency, experience, and mastery over environment. Every decision, movement, and action is informed by the continuous dialogue between human skill and architectural design. As you take this step, you reflect on the significance of this shelter beyond survival. It is both a fortress and a teacher. It mediates between body and climate, between social expectations and individual action, between memory and material. Winter has imposed its lessons, and the longhouse has ensured they are learned. The longhouse exhales a quiet warmth as winter begins its slow retreat. You settle near the hearth one last time, letting the fire's gentle glow and the lingering scent of smoke wrap around you like a familiar blanket. The house has endured months of storms, darkness, and cold, and in return, it has taught you patience, resilience, and attentiveness. Every post, every turf layer, every creaking beam carries the memory of careful observation and repeated effort. The house is more than shelter, it is a silent teacher, a repository of skill, and a witness to life lived under harsh northern skies. Outside, the snow softens, reflecting the pale sunlight that reaches the longhouse through small openings. You notice the subtle sounds of thawing, the faint drip of melting ice, the shuffle of animals stretching after days of confinement, and the whisper of wind moving gently across the roof. These signals remind you that the environment is changing, and that the months of careful observation, adjustment, and repair are paying off. You feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The house has preserved life, taught vigilance, and ensured survival. And now its lessons will carry forward as the world slowly opens. Inside, the rhythm of the longhouse slows as attention shifts from urgent survival to reflection and preparation. Tasks that were critical during the peak of winter, feeding animals, maintaining turf, tending the fire, now become quieter rituals. Each action reinforces a sense of continuity and stability, reminding you that the house has endured alongside its inhabitants. The smell of warm earth, animal hides, and lingering smoke forms a comforting presence. You breathe in deeply, letting the familiar scents anchor you in the safety and resilience that the house provides. Children move gently, exploring corners of the house with growing confidence. Adults observe, adjusting small details and preparing for the first excursions outside. There is a shared understanding that the longhouse has not merely protected, but also prepared its inhabitants. Knowledge of light, heat, sound, and spatial awareness has been internalized. Even the quietest movements are informed by lessons learned over months of observation and care. Every individual carries forward a piece of the house's wisdom, ready to respond to the challenges of early spring. You notice the subtle interplay of light and shadow across the walls. Faint beams illuminate worn floorboards and darkened timber, revealing the accumulated history of living within these walls. Patterns in the smoke-stained wood mark repeated fire tending, repairs, and routine actions. The house is alive with memory, quietly teaching and reminding all who dwell within it. It has become a partner in survival, shaping behavior, timing, and awareness. The longhouse holds the rhythm of winter in its beams and turf. And now, as snow begins to melt, It releases its occupants with a calm assurance that they are prepared for what lies ahead. You take a final moment to observe the integration of human life and architectural design. Every feature of the longhouse, from raised sleeping platforms to ventilation, from turf layers to roof pitch, demonstrates accumulated knowledge. Winter has been endured because of these careful choices, and because of the attention and effort of those who maintained the house daily. The longhouse teaches that survival is a combination of structure, practice, observation, and social cohesion. Its lessons are subtle, internalized, and continuous. As daylight grows and the first signs of thaw emerge outside, a sense of quiet completion settles over the longhouse. It has performed its role fully, and now its inhabitants are ready to step outward, carrying the knowledge, skills, and resilience gained during months of confinement. The house remains a sanctuary, a repository of memory, and a witness to the continuity of life in a harsh world. Its endurance and the experience it imparts ensure that even as winter recedes, the lessons it has taught will persist, guiding every careful step into the changing season. The wind outside feels gentler, almost as if acknowledging the efforts of the house and its inhabitants. Snow continues to melt, revealing paths towards streams, grazing areas, and distant woods. Light reaches deeper into interior spaces. The longhouse releases its occupants. Confident in the skills and awareness honed over the long months, you feel the quiet satisfaction of survival, the calm assurance of knowledge gained, and the comfort of structures and routines that have endured. Winter may still linger, but within the longhouse, life has been preserved, learned, and strengthened. Every creak, every beam, every patch of turf holds the quiet story of endurance. Sweet dreams.